You awaken lying on damp straw, shivering uncontrollably. The air around you carries the scent of cold smoke, worn wool, and an unmistakable animal musk. Above, a soot-streaked roof hangs low, almost pressing down. To your left, a small fire struggles weakly, fighting not to be extinguished. There are no windows, no clock ticking away the hours, no comforting hum of electricity. Only darkness, dampness, and a strange, unsettling sense that comfort has disappeared. Raising your head carefully, you feel bits of straw cling stubbornly to your cheek and the sleeve of your clothes. The blanket covering you is heavy and coarse, still chillingly cold to the touch. Your breath forms faint clouds in the cool air. The floor beneath is packed earth rather than wood, and the doorway is edged with drying mud. Just beyond a thin, perhaps barely there wall, an animal shifts its weight, releasing a slow, warm sigh. The room contains more than just you. It's neither empty nor safe by modern standards, yet it has stood firm through the night. And now it cradles you. You remain still a moment longer, not because your body is rested, but because on some primal level, your body knows that moving will only deepen the cold. The coldness has already settled into the blanket, the straw below, the damp wool around your wrists, and the air brushing your face. It isn't the sharp, biting cold of stepping outdoors in winter. It's slower, more enduring, a patient chill that has seeped into every corner of these walls. The floor, the bedding, and even your bones. The straw beneath is no longer mere bedding. It's become a flattened, sour-smelling truce between you and the hard ground. Some of it is dry enough to crackle softly when you shift. Other parts cling damply to your skin as you push yourself up. The sack that once held this straw, if it ever was truly intact, has long surrendered its shape. Hard knots of earth beneath you have pressed into your shoulder and hip. Your body sensed every detail even as you slept. The weak fire flickers again, sending out a dull, steady pulse into the otherwise silent room. This isn't the comforting hearth you might picture from a storybook, not a wide stone hearth roaring with warmth. Instead, it's just a shallow hollow of ash and embers, with a few charred sticks nurturing a fragile orange flame that flickers as if one careless gust could extinguish it. The light it casts is broken and uncertain. It stretches out hesitantly, illuminating the lower edges of the room, the legs of a worn stool, the curved, soot-darkened side of a pot, the jagged line where the closest wall meets the floor, then slips away again. Nothing here is ever fully bathed in light. Everything emerges in fragments. You blink and open your eyes wider, forcing yourself to look closely. The room is low and packed in tight. Above, thick beams stretch across the ceiling, darkened by years of smoke. The walls are crude, patched in places, a testament not to decoration but to necessity and survival. Each item around you seems less a choice and more a survivor. Near the fire, a wooden bowl sits, humble and utilitarian. A cloak hangs limply from a peg. In the corner, a bucket leans with a heavy tilt, as though weighed down by endless use and rarely given a second thought. At the threshold, dried mud has layered itself in stubborn streaks, almost as if the outside world seeps in uninvited, refusing to be shut out. And maybe that is the room's first undeniable truth. There's no sharp divide separating inside from outside here. The cold breathes in. Dampness presses through. The scent of animals drifts in and settles. Mud tracks across the floor like an unwelcome guest. Even the sparse daylight, when it arrives, slips quietly through narrow cracks. A shy, gray apology rather than a full embrace. Shelter exists, yes, but only as a matter of degrees. This room is better than the open field, better than trudging the road, better than standing in the rain. It is not comfort. It is survival made barely tolerable. Your gaze drops to your clothing. You're wrapped in rough wool, coarse, heavy fabric that's slightly damp where the seams rub. It scratches your neck and bunches awkwardly at the elbows. This fabric was fashioned for toughness, not for comfort. You pick at the edge of a sleeve with your fingers and feel the stiffness. Smoke and cold trapped in its fibers. Even the blanket that covers you feels similar, not soft or inviting. It's a barrier, a thin, grudging layer standing between your skin and the chill air. Somewhere beyond the walls, a bird offers a tentative call and then falls silent. Morning is arriving, though the room seems reluctant to acknowledge it. The little light sneaking in is dull, gray, already weary. As if the day has dawned beneath clouds and will carry on that way. It catches in drifting smoke, revealing the air itself suspended in dust, ash, and breath for a fleeting moment. This place doesn't awaken all at once. It emerges slowly, steadily. You shift your position and immediately feel the body's complaints awaken along with you. Your neck aches from sleeping in an awkward position. Your shoulder is sore against the hard earth beneath the sparse straw. Your toes feel numb, your wrists chilled, and your mouth dry. It's not a sharp pain or dramatic agony. It's that persistent, dull discomfort. The kind that almost goes unnoticed. This feeling was here before you even opened your eyes. It was waiting patiently. Hardship in a place like this doesn't announce itself with loud fanfare. Instead, it greets you quietly the moment you wake. Yet, despite this, your body, wise and stubborn in its own way, has already begun to adjust. It notices where the last bits of warmth linger. It keeps your hands tucked under the blanket just a little longer. It learns which movements stir the cold air too abruptly, and which can be done slowly, carefully, to avoid waking the chill all at once. Your nose, sharpening, begins to pick out the familiar scents. Damp straw, old smoke, worn wool, ash, earth, and the faint breath of animals. Your eyes start to map the room. The weak flicker of the fire, the low ceiling, the doorway, the cooking pot, the humble stool. Your body doesn't make grand declarations about endurance. It simply begins the work of survival. This is the second truth. Life here persists not because it's comfortable or easy, but because resisting it offers no gain. The room demands very little from you, not dignity or comfort, only that you wake, take notice, and endure. There's a harshness in this reality, undeniably, but also something unexpectedly soothing. When comfort is no longer expected, small details take on new importance. The ember that still glows faintly, the extra fold of blanket offering refuge, the corner of the room least touched by drafts, the fact the roof has held, the fire still burns, and morning, dreary as it is, has arrived. The room hasn't grown any kinder since you first opened your eyes. But now, it becomes understandable. The initial shock loosens its grip. What first felt like senseless misery begins to reveal itself as a pattern. Someone tended that fire last night. Someone laid down this very straw. Someone patched the cracked wall. Someone carried water in that bucket, stirred the meal in that pot, hung that cloak carefully, crossed this muddy threshold in the pitch dark and didn't stumble. The room remains cold, rough, thick, with smells that no modern life would tolerate for an hour. But it has form. It has been occupied, lived in, survived through repetition. And once the first shock begins to fade, the room itself takes shape, shaped by the people within it. The moment you realize you're not alone here, the room changes. By the weak hearth, a woman kneels with the calm, measured movements of someone who has already been awake far longer than she would have liked. That feeble fire belongs to her in a way it doesn't to the rest of the room. She knows exactly how close she can lean without suffocating the fragile flame, precisely when to shift the blackened sticks to keep the tiniest spark alive, and the perfect moment to stir the pot hanging above without disturbing it too much. Nothing she does is hurried, nothing wasted, even in this dim, cold room. Her actions flow as if repetition has taught her where every item belongs, and how much effort each task demands. You will soon learn her name, Agnes. For now, she is only the woman by the hearth, her face half turned toward the dull glow, one side softly warmed by orange light, the other swallowed by shadow. Her hair is pulled back in a way that speaks to practicality rather than pride. A few loose strands drift with the scent of smoke. Her sleeves are rolled just enough to keep them clear of the pot. Her knuckles are red and roughened by such constant labor that her work no longer feels like a struggle but a habit. Fatigue nestles deep within her, yet beneath it lies something stronger and far more vital: the will to carry on. Near the far wall, wrapped in a blanket too thin to truly protect him, a child watches you. He is small, not in the carefree way of children who have always had enough, but narrow of wrist, wide-eyed and still. His stillness is less innocent wonder and more careful observation. The threadbare blanket reaches up to his chin, held tight in both hands, as though to keep the cold and harsh world at bay. His hair lies flat from sleep in the rough cloth beneath him. He blinks once, then again, holding your gaze with the solemn attention of someone who has not yet decided if you belong here. This is Will, before he even speaks. If he ever will. The room itself feels different because of him. A child in a place like this shifts its weight. The hardship that clings to every corner remains, but with a child present, the room assumes a new kind of balance. You look at the smoke, the worn blanket, the weak fire, the rough bowl by the hearth, and suddenly none of these objects feel ordinary. They become shields keeping this boy from the cold, from hunger, from a world eager to reduce everything to mud, dampness, and waiting. Agnes finally turns her gaze to you, clearly for the first time. Her eyes scan your face swiftly, not with fear, but with cold calculation. She situates you within the morning's flow just as she does the pot, the bowl, firewood, and blanket. It's not surprise exactly, more an adjustment, a reality to be managed. There's suspicion in her gaze, but no panic. Panic would be a luxury she cannot afford. "You're awake," she says finally. Her voice is lower than you anticipated, rough from smoke and the early hour, yet steady. The words are simple and practical, stripped of any softness that might invite misunderstanding. Still, they're undeniably human, and that alone brings a measure of relief. Until she spoke, the room seemed ruled by cold and discomfort rather than life. Now it belongs, if only a little, to people you try to answer, but your throat feels raw and scraped raw, parched by the night's dry air, or the smoke, or simply the room itself. The sound you manage is barely a word. Agnes doesn't press you. Instead, she reaches for a bowl beside the hearth and lifts it with steady, practiced hands, testing its heat against her skin. The wooden rim is rough and uneven, darkened from countless washes that never quite made it clean. Thin steam rises from the bowl, carrying a plain, almost sad scent. Grain and water, a faint bitterness from overboiled greens, and a whisper of smoke. not by design, but from proximity to the fire. Yet, after the cold of the room, this warmth feels almost ceremonial. She places the bowl carefully in your hands. Heat transfers immediately, awakening your fingers, not enough to soothe, but enough to remind your body warmth still exists in the world. You hold the bowl a moment before sipping, letting the heat seep slowly into your skin. Across from you, Will watches intently, as if this simple exchange carries weight beyond words. The pottage is gray, inconsistent, thick here, thin there, as if the pot itself was unsure what it intended to be. A few softened grains float through the mix, and some green has dissolved almost entirely into the broth. By any generous standard, it's unappetizing, but it is warm, and after all, warmth transforms everything here. The first swallow tastes blunt, humble, and real. Grain, smoke, a hint of salt so faint it feels like memory rather than seasoning. Meanwhile, Agnes has already turned back to the hearth. This, more than anything, reveals the kind of life you live here. There is no time to create moments or linger to see if you appreciate the food, recognize the room, or pity yourself. The day is in motion. The pottage must be stirred, the fire coaxed back to life. The child watched, the room guarded against slipping back into cold. Life here refuses to pause for explanation. It moves forward with understanding trailing behind. You take a careful look around, now that the initial shock fades. The walls near the hearth are deeply darkened where smoke has lingered the longest. Above, the timber beams vanish into black soot. Near the door, a peg holds up what could be a second cloak, so patched and worn that it looks less woven garment and more a heavy, damp weight that never quite dries. In one corner, a small cluster of objects blends into one another. A wooden bucket, a low stool, a bundle of kindling tied with frayed cord, and a basket so fragile at the rim it seems held together more by memory than by willow. Nothing here is ornamental. Every item exists solely to serve a purpose. Yet, with Agnes and Will present, the room no longer feels like a trap. The space is hard and almost airless, thick with smoke, labor, and the tired scent of things kept too close. But it's lived in, and that changes the feeling entirely. A room loses its threat once its rhythm reveals itself. The bowl by the fire, the blanket against the wall, the spot where Agnes kneels, the way Will tucks his feet beneath the thin cloth, the pot's slight turn as she stirs. Each object seems to know its place even before the day really begins. At last, Will stirs beneath the blanket and speaks so softly you almost miss it. Is he staying? Agnes doesn't look at him but answers simply, "For now." The reply carries no warmth or chill, just enough, just what is needed. In that one phrase, the room's entire economy is clear. No promises beyond what can be kept, no offers beyond what the day can bear. Yet, those words shift the air somehow, placing you, if only briefly, inside the quiet arithmetic of the hut. Not trust, not romance, but a sort of accounting. Will studies you a little longer, then lowers his eyes to the bowl you hold. He carries the quiet patience of a child who has learned not to ask for too much. There are children who fill a room with motion and noise, and others like Will, who early on sense adults are listening for signs of trouble, weakness, waste, or need, and grow careful accordingly. Will occupies less space than his body demands, as if he has already understood that food, heat, and attention are scarce resources. Agnes reaches for another bowl, filling it more sparingly than yours. You notice this, not because she means anything by it, but because the room teaches you how to observe. Portions matter here. Who eats first matters. Who sits closer to the fire matters. How much grain goes into the pot matters. These small domestic acts aren't mere background. They shape the structure of life here. This isn't a world where life happens elsewhere, and meals just support it. Here, the meal is itself part of the struggle, and strangely, once you grasp that truth, the room becomes easier to endure. Survival becomes clearer when it is anchored to familiar names, gestures, and a space that consistently repeats itself. Think of Agnes by the hearth, will wrapped beneath the blanket, the bowl resting in your hands, smoke lingering in the rafters, the low, worn stool, the rough, uneven wall, the feeble fire flickering weakly. Life remains harsh, yet it now has shape and meaning. It follows habits. It unfolds in sequence. It begins again with morning. Agnes carefully sets Will's bowl down, and finally lowers herself onto her heels, not fully resting but taking a brief pause between essential tasks. The firelight dances in her eyes, lending them a sparkle brighter than their usual dullness. Will receives his portion with careful hands, as if afraid the warmth might vanish before it reaches him. There you all sit, the woman, the child, and the stranger, connected not yet by affection, but by the simple fact of sharing shelter indoors while the cold lingers outside. A little warmth, a little routine, two familiar faces, together, they soften even the harshest of worlds. The hut has not changed. It remains smoke-stained, damp, meager, and cramped. Yet now it holds a pattern the body can rely upon. Someone tends the fire. Someone watches the child. Someone knows exactly where the bowl belongs, and when the pot must be stirred. The room is still difficult, certainly, but it is no longer chaos. Human presence shapes it. Human repetition makes it understandable. Because of this newfound legibility, the space becomes almost comforting. Almost beyond the hut lies the larger village, along with the unforgiving rules that govern every meal and every fear. Step outside, and the village does not welcome you. It exposes you. The cold strikes sharper here, less forgiving than inside. It moves freely over the open ground, slipping through the damp fabric of your clothes and finding every spot the weak fire failed to warm. Beneath your boots, the path is barely a path at all, just churned mud pressed flat by countless feet and many seasons. Water pools in shallow footprints. Straw lies trampled into the earth, blending until it seems part of the soil itself. The air hangs heavy with the smell of wet ash, manure, smoke, and the sour weight of lives sustained with effort. Around you, the huts lean with weariness, their roofs sag under old thatch, darkened by rain and time. One wall bows outward. Another bears a rough patch of newer wood, evidence of a village forever mending but never quite keeping pace. Thin smoke drifts from holes in roofs and low chimneys, not in steady lines but weak, uncertain wisps that hover more than escape. Nothing here is sealed, not the huts, not the narrow lanes, not the lives held within them. A hen busily scratches at the muddy ground beside a fence that leans awkwardly to one side. Nearby, a goat stands silently, embodying the weary patience of an animal long resigned to discomfort. Its ribs are visible beneath its patchy coat. Beyond the simple huts stretch fields, brown, exhausted, their furrows uneven, their yield uncertain. This isn't the idyllic countryside painted in storybooks or illuminated manuscripts. This is hard, working land. Thin soil, pushed beyond its limits time and again. The village feels open, but not in a comforting way. It's not open and spacious. It's exposed and vulnerable. There's no corner safe from the weather, no wall thick enough to hush the demands of need. No space large enough to keep the scent or sense of hunger from drifting between neighbors. Even when standing still, you feel as if the village itself watches you. Every puddle, sagging roof, and crooked fence silently assessing whether you'll pull more from it than you contribute. Then a man steps out from between two huts. He carries himself with an air that demands attention, regardless of merit. Clad modestly, yet radiating a quiet confidence, he holds the closest thing to authority this village offers. His face is narrow and his beard uneven, eyes habitually scanning over people instead of meeting them. Here is the village elder, or someone close enough, the keeper of rules, names, debts, and the bitter contours of obedience. He doesn't greet you, he simply places you within the village's rigid order. There are fields to tend, he begins flatly, repairs to make, water to draw, grain to account for. The Lord's share must be given. The church's due respected. No one here eats by chance. His voice is deliberately devoid of drama, making the weight of his words all the more compelling. These aren't idle threats. They're the very language of this place. As he speaks, your mind reshapes the village around you. That simple hut? Not just a shelter. Its labor solidified as a roof. The muddy path? Not just a route. It's the artery through which grain, wool, and bodies flow, bound by obligation. The field? Not mere earth. It's a ledger already partly written upon by others. Even the smoke curling from Agnes's chimney changes meaning. No longer mere domestic clatter. It becomes proof that fuel was gathered, that food was prepared, that work has officially commenced. Later, the steward arrives, although his presence seems to precede him. You sense it before seeing him, the sudden stiffening of shoulders at the word dues, the hushed voices when neighbors discuss grain, Agnes' careful counting, not only of what she owns, but of what she lets the eyes of others witness. When the man himself finally appears, on foot or mounted, moving with the hard efficiency of borrowed power, you have enough understanding to grasp his role without words. He is not the Lord, and in some ways, that makes him even more formidable. The Lord remains distant, almost symbolic, like the weather itself. But the steward is tangible, real, with a face and a ledger, relentlessly counting. He knows exactly how many sacks of grain should be delivered, how many hens are owed, how many days of labor must be given, how much wool gathered, and how much obedience expected. He is the grasping hand reaching into every village life, declaring what portion belongs not to the people, but to the Lord. The church, softer in tone but just as invasive, steps in as well. They call it a tenth for God, yet it comes from the same depleted stores. Grain taken from already scarce supplies, eggs withheld from hungry mouths, labor diverted from daily needs, fears transformed into dutiful actions. Here, devotion is not some abstract ideal. It is a measured, concrete part of village life. The ringing bell, the priest's blessing over seed or meal, all rest beside the harsh reality that holiness is also just an obligation, another item in the village economy. No one voices protest or outrage. This is another harsh lesson. The system is not hidden. It's plainly visible, yet no one debates as if such discussion might loosen its grip. The fields owe tribute. The huts owe tribute. The households owe tribute. Even the bodies owe tribute. Work in the Lord's fields. Repairs to his buildings. Payments to church and manor. Service when summoned. Submission when observed. This is the rhythm of life. The village is not ruled by random cruelty, but by steady extraction. Grain flows upward, labor flows upward, fear turns inward, Only then do you recognize how every object in Agnes' hut has been molded by this relentless pressure. The thin pottage simmering in the pot, the worn blanket covering the bed, the patched cloak hanging by the door, the weak fire struggling for warmth, the quiet child who watches before he dares to speak. None of these is happenstance. Poverty here is not mere misfortune. It is deliberate and structured. The village is arranged so survival is just barely possible, always shadowed by claims from forces larger than itself. This is the village's true architecture. Medieval life is not chaos or random suffering. It is patterned pressure. The huts sag under the same sky and rain. The same muddy earth clings to every worn boot. The same church bell tolls. The same dues are tallied. The same hands gather grain destined never to stay where it was grown. Of course, people adapt. They must. Agnes knows what can be concealed, what can be spoken, and what must be surrendered. The elders understand every obligation's shape. The steward calculates needs into numbers. Even the animals seem aware they live just shy of plenty. Once you grasp these rules, your mind no longer thrashes blindly against them. This understanding doesn't soften the world, but renders it comprehensible. The Lord takes, the church takes, the weather takes, the body offers, the field offers, the hut holds on to whatever it can. There's a grim steadiness in this pattern, and strangely, steadiness is easier to bear than confusion. Now you see why the bowl held thin gruel, why Agnes's eyes appraised every detail, and why the room seemed to count silently, even as it sheltered. Yet recognizing structure doesn't resolve the deeper truth. Hunger pulses beneath it all. By the time you fully understand the village, hunger has already begun to explain everything else. It doesn't announce itself with noise or urgency. It doesn't come crashing in like a storm or bellowed warning. Instead, it settles quietly. In the humble hut, the empty bowl, the bare field, and the way Agnes gently lifts the pot's lid, peering inside as if the numbers might shift if only she watches long enough. It's there in the silence before anyone eats, in the tiny loaf barely filling the table, in the way Will swallows too fast, and then tries to act as if he's not still hungry. The entire household orbits around one simple truth. There is never enough. Agnes keeps the pottage simmering because stopping feels like conceding defeat. The pot hangs just above the fire, its contents thin enough to ripple like water with each stir, yet thick enough in places to hint at what it strives to be. Mostly grain, though not much of it, and a few greens boiled down until they've lost all distinctness. A sharp bitterness lingers at the edges of the taste, something once perhaps nourishing, now barely edible. This isn't cooking in the comforting sense. It's survival. It stretches resources. It delays hunger. It's a way of making one handful speak with the voice of two. The smell is modest, even by a humble hut's standards. Warmth, yes, that always helps. Warmth can almost improve anything. But it cannot make this meal generous. The pottage smells of overstretched grain, of water drawn from hard toil, of leaves that never imagined they would matter so much. Agnes offers no apologies. She doesn't have to. The pot says all that's needed. So does the precise way she scrapes the sides before serving, ensuring no morsel of value remains unreachable. Sometimes bread appears. Calling it bread feels hopeful. It's dense, dark, and tightly packed, absorbing more light than it reflects. A single loaf rests on the table with the weight and firmness of a stone. When sliced, it doesn't open softly, but resists. The crust is harder than it ought to be, and the inside is dry, demanding more effort from the jaw than comfort for the stomach. There's little pleasure here, Yet when Agnes places even a small piece before them, Will's eyes fix on it immediately. So do yours. Hunger has a way of transforming poor fare into something almost sacred. The crust sheds crumbs. Those crumbs matter. That's a lesson the village teaches quickly. No fragment is too small to count. Agnes gathers crumbs deftly with a finger and drops them back into the bowl. Will licks a stray crumb off his thumb with a seriousness that once would have seemed absurd. Even the hard crust pieces left uneaten are never discarded, just set aside, as if time itself could soften them into something useful. Here, waste isn't a moral failing. It's a practical one. And there are days when the stew leans more heavily on weeds than anything else. Agnes sends Will to scour the edges of the path, or the outskirts of the field. Not too far, never too far. He gathers leaves, roots, bitter things that demand boiling twice before the tongue can accept them. The kitchen during famine is packed with ingredients no one would call food if better choices existed nearby. Yet, the pot receives them all with indifferent acceptance. Chop them fine, boil them long, and suddenly it all begins to look like survival. Sometimes, as Agnes cooks, Will coughs into his blanket. Not constantly, not yet enough to color the whole day, but frequently enough. Each cough draws her glance toward him. Each fit hushes the room slightly, as if everyone is listening, waiting to see what the cough might turn into tomorrow or the day after. He always pulls through quickly, drawing a sharp breath and acting as if nothing happened. In these times, children learn pride early because there is too little food and too much worry. His wrists are narrow, so is his neck. Children have a way of looking simply young, but hunger leaves a mark that changes their shape and posture. Will still moves like a child, quick and alert, turning suddenly toward voices outside, or leaning forward to catch the scent rising from the pot. Yet his body remembers what it has lacked. There is a lightness to him, not ease, but a fragile thinness around his cheeks. And his eating is careful, fast at first, then slowing as he understands there will be no second helping. Agnes watches all of this, though she does not seem to watch. This is perhaps the hardest part of her, not cruelty, but the discipline of not allowing worry to drain her body's strength. She counts silently while she works. She knows how much grain remains without breaking the sack. Opened eye to eye. She calculates how many meals this single loaf can make. She measures how much fuel the fire can spare before night falls. When she glances into the pot twice, it is not forgetfulness. Famine teaches repetition, and repetition feels like caution. Somewhere hidden beneath the floorboards, behind a loose plank, or tucked beneath straw and cloth, in a way only she understands, there is a small secret stash. Not much, and that smallness is what makes it so grave. A handful more grain than there should be. A small wrapped piece of something dried and preserved. A handful not enough to spark hope, but enough to give pause, and bring danger. The presence of hidden food changes a room even when no one speaks of it. It weds secrecy to every ordinary motion. Agnes moves by one corner with just a bit too much care. She lowers her voice when the topic of stores comes up. Once, when Will strayed too near a certain board, she redirected him sharply, though the sternness vanished almost as soon as it came. This hidden grain is no abundance. It is breathing room, time measured in days, or perhaps less. Because it exists, Agnes must now reckon not only with hunger, but with discovery. Outside, the fields offer scant comfort. From afar, they still resemble fields in the broadest sense. Lines, furrows, effort, promise. Yet, up close, that promise fades. The earth feels exhausted. The stalks are thinner than they'd ever hoped, and some patches have almost entirely failed. leaving bare spots that feel less like abandoned fields and more like forsaken ground. What does grow does so reluctantly, as if the soil has been asked the same question too many times and no longer has any generous answers left. The rain hasn't come when it should have, or it arrived at the wrong moment, or perhaps the ground itself has lost faith in the season. Nobody speaks these truths aloud. They don't need to. The fields reveal their story in meager harvests. The threshing tells the deeper truth later. The sack knows. So does the oven. Hunger probably starts in the weather, or in taxes, or just bad luck. But by the time it reaches the hut, it has become intimate. It sits at the table. It claims its place by the hearth. It listens as the spoon scrapes the bottom of the bowl. That is why famine feels so personal. It doesn't linger in the sky or the fields. It crosses the threshold and learns the names and faces of those inside. Agnes quietly cuts the serving smaller. Will asks fewer questions during supper. You find yourself sipping slowly, not because the pottage tastes better, but to delay the emptiness waiting beneath. The body becomes keenly aware of tiny chances. A crust left behind, an unspoiled turnip, a patch of greens near the ditch, the slight thickness at the pot's bottom where grain has settled. Hunger doesn't just weaken, it sharpens and trains. And as food grows ever scarcer, even the smallest portion gains a solemn importance. Crust transforms from just bread to tomorrow inching ever closer. A spoonful becomes more than sustenance. It's a small warmth against the body's unrest. Even stirring the pot takes on a heavy meaning because everyone knows the contents fall short, yet must pretend otherwise. This is hunger's shape in a place like this. Not a grand drama, but a tightening. The world shrinks, then shrinks again. Fewer choices, fewer ingredients, fewer careless acts, fewer chances to err. A day that once held weather, conversation, work, and wandering thoughts now circles a single, pressing question. How much remains, and how far can it stretch? Famine isn't a singular event. It's the slow constriction of daily life until every crumb carries weight. It's Agnes touching the sack before sleep. It's Will eyeing the bread before the faces around him. It's the hush that falls when the pot nears empty. It's the fields observed not for their beauty, but for their arithmetic. The body is learning a new kind of gratitude, one measured in smaller, more fragile increments than ever before. As the grip of hunger tightens, a subtler fear begins to seep quietly into the village. It starts with a cough, one that doesn't belong to the morning routine. This isn't the usual clearing of a throat from smoke or the brief roughness caused by cold air rushing into a warm chest. No, this cough lingers, catching halfway, then hardening before it breaks free in a thin, persistent fit that seems to make the room hold its breath even after the sound fades. You hear it before you realize whose it is. Then you catch Agnes glancing toward the blanket near the hearth, and that glance alone speaks volumes. Will has pulled the cloth tighter around himself, but there's no hiding the fact that he's more than just tired. His eyes burn with an unnatural brightness, the skin visible at his temples, and beneath his lashes carries that peculiar pallor children get when their bodies are battling something unknown. Something new. He isn't flushed from play or warmth. Instead, a fever seems to blaze deep beneath his skin, a private fire that refuses permission to die down. One hand lies exposed outside the blanket, palm open against the coarse fabric. Even from across the room, you can tell his warmer than the air allows. Agnes remains still at first, saying nothing. She reaches for the back of her hand and gently presses it against Will's forehead, a gesture so familiar it must have been repeated countless times before, for lesser illnesses, smaller worries, and easier nights. But this night is different. Her hand lingers a moment longer than usual. Her face shifts imperceptibly. The eyes narrow just a little. The mouth sets into a quiet line. She doesn't panic. Panic is a useless luxury here, and the hut cannot afford such things. Yet somehow, the very air seems to constrict around that one touch. From somewhere farther away, outside the hut, a new sound drifts in. A bell. Not close enough to shake the walls, nor grand enough to command the sky. Just the slow, measured toll from the church, floating through damp air to reach the village in deliberate iron notes. In another season, another morning, that bell might signal prayer, a summons, or simply mark the passage of time. But today, coming after the cough, it enters the room transformed. It doesn't break the silence. It blends with it, deepening the worry. Without a word, Agnes turns back toward the hearth. The pot sits ready on the fire, the water not quite boiled yet. Still, she stirs the pot, her hands moving as if the motion alone could speed the heat to its task. From somewhere in the dim room, a small bundle of dried herbs comes into view. Not hidden, but carefully set aside. She crushes the leaves finely between her fingers. The scent is bitter, meant for fever, cough, or comfort. Often all three indistinguishable in a hut like this. The herbs fall into the water, and immediately the aroma shifts. The smoky, damp wool scent lingers, but now mingled with the sharp green tang of crushed stalks, the faint medicinal promise rising in the steam. Outside, a cough echoes. A sharp reply to another. Then another follows. No one calls it illness, at least not out loud. No one utters plague, not yet. Maybe not even in secret thoughts. Still, the village starts to listen closely, as villages do when misfortune begins to share it. Doors close a bit more quietly. Voices soften. Someone hurries past the hut, then slows down further along, hesitating as if wondering whether to knock on another door. The lane no longer feels empty, but uncertain, cautious. Will coughs again, this time the sound lower, rougher. Agnes lifts him gently, steadying his shoulders with one hand as her other brings the steaming cup to his lips. He drinks because she asks him, not because he wants to. The liquid is too hot, too bitter, and the fevered body tolerates neither well. Still, he swallows. A drop escapes the corner of his mouth, and she wipes it away with the edge of her sleeve before settling him back against the blanket. The gesture is small, almost ritualistic. Lift, hold, offer, wait, wipe, lower. This is care stripped of grandeur, simple, essential, relentless. This is how sickness arrives in a place like this. Not in spectacle, but through repetition, shifted just enough to cast everything into doubt. The bowl remains full, though now with herb-infused water. The hand still reaches across the room, but now to check the heat instead of handing over bread. The fire continues to burn, but now because something must stay boiling. The room does not cease being itself. Indeed, that is the very issue. Illness slips into everyday life and reshapes it quietly from within. By noon, the news has spread without any single messenger. A woman 2 huts down has not risen from her bed. A child near the lane breathes oddly. The old man by the church did not leave his house this morning. Those who visited returned quickly, speaking little. The village does not need to convene to understand. It comprehends through accumulation. A door left shut, a bell rung twice, instead of once, a cartwheel where no market cart should be, a hurried glance away from a simple question. Agnes turns to you and says, "Go fetch water." The bucket is made of wood and feels heavier than it appears, its handle worn smooth and darkened by countless hands over the years. Outside, the well stands as it always has, Yet today the space around it feels constrained, as though people instinctively keep their distance beyond what the well itself demands. You lower the bucket, hearing the ropes scrape and protest against the stone's edge. When you haul it up again, the water is cold and murky, tinged with a faint, green-brown hue, a sign of a source repeatedly tapped but never fully trusted. You linger over it longer than you would have just a day before. Back in the hut, Agnes has spread the herbs across a stool, sorting through what remains. Some are still fresh enough that crushing them releases a lively scent. Others have dried to near dustiness. A sprig hung by the hearth has turned gray at the edges. Her choices come from memory, not certainty. This one for warmth, that one for the chest, another because her mother once used it, and the child had slept afterward. She keeps one because it was blessed by the priest on a saint's day. No one wants to waste a blessing. She lacks the language of physicians or neat theories that make illness orderly and comprehensible. Instead, she has leaves, steam, cloth, and the authority carried by the repetition of methods known through generations. By afternoon, prayer drifts through the village like shifting weather, not confined to church or formal words. It comes as whispered pleas over bowls of broth, subtle signs made upon doorways, and scraps of blessed thread tied where a child might touch it as they sleep. Here, someone hangs garlic or onion by a door. Elsewhere, smoke curls from something burned to cleanse the air. Voices murmur among themselves. The fever follows dampness. It follows the dead. It is punishment. It is simply the season turning cruelly against the poor once again. You hear all these murmurs. What feels odd is that none of it sounds foolish within the village walls. Not because the explanations are scientifically valid, but because uncertainty breeds the need for any tool at hand. Here, understanding is not a battle of science versus superstition. It is a community of helplessness dressing itself in action. A thread tied, broth boiled, prayer repeated, floor swept, charm hung, bucket scrubbed, blanket shaken. None of these will necessarily halt what's coming, but doing nothing would be far worse. Near dusk, a cart passes down the muddy road. You cannot clearly make out what lies beneath the cloth covering it, only the solemn faces of the men pulling it forward. Their expressions carry that heavy resolve people wear when they accept a grim duty, no matter how unwilling they are. The wheels groan through the mud, leaving tracks wider than a handcart should. Not one voice breaks the silence. No one asks questions that might demand answers. By then, Will sleeps, though his rest is uneasy. The fever stubbornly lingers. Will's breath falters, first quick, then slow, catching briefly before smoothing out again. Nearby, Agnes remains as still as a statue, resolute not to move unless Will does first. Occasionally, she moistens a rag and presses it to his hot forehead. At other moments, she lifts a cup to his lips. Her eyes sometimes drift toward the door, straining to catch even the faintest sound from the village. A sign that might declare if this is just Will's sickness or something far worse sweeping through every home simultaneously. The room feels smaller now, but not in the cramped way hunger once made it seem, when every crumb was precious. This is a different shrinking now. Every cough carries weight. Every silence that follows a cough holds tension. Every touch of warmth to the brow. Every delay in a door creaking open. It all matters. The village fears the plague not because it shouts, but because it seeps into daily life, turning the familiar uncertain and fragile. The bowl resting by the fire takes on a new significance. The bell rings with unfamiliar meaning. Even the water feels charged with threat. The very air seems altered. Because once breath itself becomes suspect, nothing in the room remains neutral or safe. Yet, amidst this, The response to illness has not changed. It's still about the tender routines, tending, boiling water, waiting, watching. Agnes keeps the water hot, stirring the herbs gently. She wipes Will's damp face with care when coughing worsens. She lifts him up when exhaustion overtakes him. She lowers him down again. No drama fills the hut, only a quiet, focused attentiveness. Perhaps the most profound form of fear is not rage or flight, but this, noticing, bearing witness to every small detail. Outside, footsteps pass, then stop just beyond the wall. Two voices murmur low. Though their words are faint, some words cut through. Grain. Steward, before he returns, not safe here in the hut. Better to be hidden than counted. The illness has not wiped out hunger. It has sharpened it. Fear of fever now dances alongside the dread of being drained dry by taxes and dues. The hut must shield the child. Yes, but it must also guard the future. This primal urge to survive twists into secrecy as fear and hunger push the village toward quiet rebellion. After dark, Agnes makes her decision, one that has likely been growing within her for days. There is no grand announcement, no setting down the bowl with a fiery speech to warm the chill in the room. Instead, once Will finally slips into a lighter, gentler sleep by the hearth, she reaches beneath a loose board near the wall and lifts out a small sack of grain with both hands. Even in the dim light, its size betrays its significance, too small to be much, yet too precious to leave where prying eyes might discover it. She places it on her lap and rests her palm gently atop it, not possessively, but protectively, like placing a hand on a child's back to feel the steady rise and fall of breathing. They will take the rest, she says quietly. There's no anger, no drama, just a simple, sober truth. The fire now burned low, casting flickering shadows in the small hut that held the quiet stillness of a place trying hard not to wake its own illness. Will's breathing was gentler than it had been earlier, though not yet easy enough to forget the fever that lingered on his flushed face. Outside, the wind whispered against the hut's walls. Before moving on, somewhere in the distance, a dog gave a half-hearted bark, then thought better of continuing. Agnes carefully loosened the sack's mouth and peered inside. You stepped back slightly, sharing the same cautious curiosity, as if looking too directly might somehow steal away what little remained. The grain inside was sparse. That was the undeniable truth. A shallow promise of the future, just enough to stretch over a handful of meals. Rough, pale shapes of food, small but crucial, enough to matter. Desperately so, enough to vanish if the wrong hands took notice. A quantity so fragile that the difference between keeping it and losing it could one day be seen in the change of Will's weary face. Agnes tied the sack shut again and spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. If it stays here, it is not ours. That was the closest she came to explaining her plan. Her plan, if it could be called that, was as simple as it was necessary, because simplicity often survives where cleverness ensnares itself. At first light, before the village was fully awake, and before the steward's men ventured beyond their usual paths, the grain would be moved from the hut to the edge of the forest. Not deep enough to draw wolves, thieves, or risk being forgotten, but just far enough that a casual or hurried search would overlook it. She knew of an old hollow log just beyond the village's rough boundary, where the villagers' fear of the woods began. She was not alone in this knowledge. That was part of its usefulness. It was a place no one owned, no one cherished, and so no one counted. You asked her quietly if such a move was wise. Agnes gave the tiniest shrug. Hunger is not wise either, she said simply. The conversation ended there before dawn. The hut was alive with whispered movement. Agnes folded the sack within a torn outer cloth so that, at a glance, it looked like little more than firewood or refuse. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. Will was pale and sluggish with sleep, but was given strict instructions to stay near the hearth and to open the door only if Marjorie came. He nodded with the solemn determination of a child trying to mask his weakness. Agnes bent down and with a quick, gentle touch, stroked his hair once before standing and preparing to leave. Outside, the village lay mostly gray and still. Mist clung low to the ground. The rooftops shimmered faintly with dampness. Smoke had not yet begun to rise from each chimney, making the air feel more open, quieter, less observed. A cartwheel creaked in the distance. A rooster began a hesitant crow, then stopped midway. The lane was still muddy as always, but the cold had stiffened its surface overnight, and it was only just beginning to soften again with a gradual return of morning. You walked a little ahead, then a little behind Agnes, never certain where a proper lookout belonged in this hushed, fragile hour. Agnes carries the sack cradled in both arms, its weight seeming to defy its modest size, not because of the grain within, but because the burden of risk itself gnaws at her strength. Every step she takes is deliberate, yet not exaggerated. She doesn't creep. Creeping would invite suspicion. Instead, she moves with the steady everyday purpose of someone already busy with work. This is part of the village's survival craft, mastering the art of making necessity appear routine. The huts grow fewer as the path turns. A fence, half collapsed and weary, marks the boundary of a field. Beyond it, the land becomes wilder, thistles prickling the soil, brambles twisting in uncertain tangles, the early reach of trees. The forest doesn't burst forward suddenly. It gathers in shadows and deepens in darkness, leaning closer. Its edge isn't a sharp line, but a slow barter between open field and encroaching shade. At a bend in the lane, Tom waits, pretending to examine a broken stretch of wattle fence, as if dawn's light has stirred a sudden feigned worry about fencing. He says nothing as you approach, only muttering that he's seen no one pass beyond the widow from the lower hut and a boy sent for water. His voice is casual, almost bored, and his eyes stay trained on the fence. As Agnes passes, he shifts a twig in his hand and, just a little louder, remarks, "This won't hold through winter." It may seem odd, but this is what cooperation looks like here. No solemn promises, no secret meetings, just barely hidden usefulness woven through common chores. Further along, Marjorie appears near the lane, a basket balanced on one arm, the usual basket she carries, though today it holds scarcely more than a withered sprig of green and a turnip shaped like a clenched fist. She calls behind her to the huts, asking for more wood, then glances at Agnes' bundle and at you. That glance alone says enough. She will look after Will, ask no unnecessary questions, and listen keenly for the early sound of hoofbeats. By the time you reach the forest's edge, the village is fully waking. Smoke coils more steadily now. A child wails somewhere nearby. A woman scolds a hen from her doorway. Ordinary morning noises sharpened by the knowledge that any of them might become unexpected witnesses. Agnes doesn't rush, yet a sense of urgency pulses behind every move. She steps over a gnarled root, skirts a puddle mottled with leaf rot, and advances toward a patch of bramble hiding an old log house. The hollow looks far less promising than memory had made it seem. One side of the hiding spot is slick with damp moss, blending almost seamlessly into the forest floor. The small opening remains half concealed beneath dead leaves and low, tangled brush. Inside, the wood has softened with age, Yet the center still holds dry enough space if the sack is placed just so, wrapped securely. Agnes kneels without complaint, gently setting the bundle down. She reaches in to sweep away the cold leaves and debris nestled within. Her hands move with practiced precision, not rushed, but steady and assured from necessity. The cloth covering the sack comes away easily. The sack slips silently into the shadowed hollow. A few more leaves are pulled across the entrance. Some dead brush laid on top. Then, a deep stillness settles over the spot. From your vantage point, the resting place is nearly invisible. Agnes stays crouched a moment longer, as if making sure the scene itself falls into place. The forest breathes softly around you, small sounds stirring the quiet. A branch shifts quietly high above. Something tiny rustles through the leaves. Water drips somewhere out of sight. The place isn't truly peaceful, but instead indifferent. And sometimes, in a world like this, indifference is the safest comfort a landscape can offer. You ask Agnes if anyone else knows about this spot. Enough, she replies then. After a brief pause, she adds, not too many. This is the second unspoken rule of survival beside hidden grain. Secrecy rarely exists in strict solitude. It thrives in a narrow space between isolation and trust. Too few people know. And there's no hope for help. Too many. And the secret becomes another form of exploitation. Here, the village shares a quiet understanding, not declared or organized, just quietly present. The elder who deliberately looks away, the widow who shelters a child, the old woman who lingers longer than she needs on the lane. This knowledge passes silently among them, never spoken aloud. In a society built on obedience, survival depends on the smallest acts of disobedience. Not grand revolts or public defiance, but simple, subtle acts. Shifting one sack out of sight, a lie told by omission, an extra moment spent mending a fence that doesn't need fixing, a basket carried at the right hour, a child watched over by a neighbor, while his mother quietly breaks the rules for reasons everyone understands but none name openly. The walk back feels longer, even though the path is unchanged. Perhaps because the grain no longer rests in Agnes' arms. Perhaps because absence carries its own weight of fear. The hut, once laden with hidden promise, now feels both safer and more vulnerable. If someone searches it, there's less to find. Yet, if the secret store is discovered, no excuse would hold sway. The risk has simply shifted shape. Still, Agnes' shoulders carry themselves differently now. Not relaxed, never that, but eased, less tightly drawn. The body knows when it has done something both useful and forbidden. Her pace slows as she nears the huts. She lifts the empty cloth as if it once held kindling, but now holds nothing, a quietly ordinary disappointment. She is already returning herself to the visible rhythm of the village. Because every step must be careful, this entire act settles into a tense but strangely gentle rhythm. What remains afterward isn't quite fear, although that still clings in the air. It's not exactly triumph either, though a small victory has quietly been claimed. Instead, there's this fragile harmony, as if for one brief morning stretch, every person, object, and silence somehow understood its place. Agnes walking with purpose, Tom lingering thoughtfully, Marjorie patiently waiting, the hollow log cradling what the hut cannot safely harbor. The village itself neither revealing nor concealing its secrets. Inside, Will stirs awake once more. His face remains warm, though his bright-eyed fever has softened since the night passed. Marjorie has left a small cup of broth behind, along with a grumbled remark about the frailty of children today. Whether she means Will specifically, or all children since the dawn of time, is unclear. Agnes kneels by the hearth. stirring the pot as if this has been her sole task from dawn. Will does not speak at first. Instead, he watches Agnes, then you, and then casts a glance toward the board beneath which the grain no longer lies hidden. Agnes catches this glance and replies with the barest shake of her head. Perhaps later, or maybe never. Still, despite the absence, the hut feels changed. The hidden grain is gone, yet its absence almost feels like a presence. It softens something inside, not enough to declare the room hopeful, but sufficient so the next bowl of pottage doesn't feel like surrender. Enough that Will's tentative sips are no longer overshadowed entirely by dread. Enough that Agnes's hands, though still worn and weary, move with a steadiness they lacked before. When danger loosens its grip, even for a moment, the smallest triumph can taste like a feast. By evening, the village begins, with cautious steps, to loosen its hold on fear. Not because life has transformed beyond recognition. Fields are no more generous. Huts are no drier. The future no more certain. But because for one night, or at least part of one, the pot holds thicker stew than before. The bread is real bread. Even if coarse, the fire outside serves not just for cooking or warding off cold, but as a gathering place. After weeks of meticulous measuring, dividing, hiding, and waiting, these small shifts reshape the mood of the entire place. Before you even see it, the stew announces itself. Its warm, steady aroma drifts through the lane, richer than usual, carrying more grain and a hint of something almost indulgent beneath. Though rich might be too grand a description for a simple bit of extra sustenance. Yet after days of thin broth and bitter weeds, the very thought of thickness feels like celebration. Women lift lids and stir with less suspicion. Steam rises from the cauldrons in delicate pale ribbons. Wooden bowls are stacked on stools and low boards. Children first drift toward the smell, then toward the light. The bread, too, carries a difference. The bread wasn't soft, nor was it white or abundant, but it was cut into pieces that held their shape with quiet dignity. The crust didn't challenge the teeth as harshly this time. Inside, the crumb was denser, closer textured, more bread than stone. Agnes tore off a piece and gently placed it beside Will's bowl, her eyes not calculating the cost this time. That small act alone felt like a blessing. Will noticed immediately, but said nothing. Instead, he settled near the fire, his focus solemn and deep, like a child who has learned that good things can vanish if staring too eagerly. Outside, a bonfire was already burning. It wasn't grand by any noble measure. No towering pyre, no great spectacle. Just a simple village fire, built carefully with wood gathered through hard effort, and not without sacrifice. Yet, because the fire was shared, it seemed larger than it really was. Flames licked into the dusk, bending with the wind. Sparks rose and disappeared. The smoke smelled cleaner than the thick, damp air inside the huts. It was lighter, touched by open skies instead of cramped roof beams and wet wool. Around the fire, the villagers gathered slowly, as if none wanted to admit openly that this night might hold a tiny measure of comfort. Their harvest work clung to them all. You could see it first in their hands, fingers roughened by sickles, palms streaked with dirt, wrists marked from heavy loads. The whole day had been spent bent over, repeating the same motions, cutting what could be cut, bundling what could be saved, carrying grain, as if the weight itself was a declaration that fortune had not entirely turned away. Even relief came wrapped in exhaustion. No one joined the firelight fresh. They brought their labor with them, in dust trailing their hems, straw caught in sleeves, and a dull ache lingering beneath every movement. Yet work feels different when it finally yields something. That was what softened the evening. Not fullness, certainly, nor security, but proof. Proof that the field still responded when pressed hard enough. Proof that effort hadn't vanished into emptiness. Proof that a bowl could hold more than just flavored water and herbs. The village didn't celebrate this triumph with cheers. Instead, they received it modestly. Like a weary body accepts an extra blanket or a warm stone at the feet, with gratitude genuine and too practical for display. Someone passed around a cup of weak ale, its vessel old and perhaps poorly cleaned. The drink tasted thin, sharp, and faintly sour, yet no one complained. Its worth wasn't in refinement, but simply in its presence. Older men sipped slowly and passed the cup along. Marjorie drank with a steady defiance, as if daring winter itself to return and challenge her claim. Tom, who never missed a chance to position himself where his height might hint at authority, settled near the fire's edge. He began talking of the weather, the crops, and memories, as though he had a direct line to the shifting seasons. No one interrupted tonight. Even mild vanity was easier to bear. The children drifted closest to the flames, drawn by their warmth and light. Will sits quietly on an overturned bucket, thinner than any mother would want and softer spoken than many boys his age, his eyes fixed on the fire with solemn fascination. Near him, another child squats, absently poking the dirt with a stick. A little girl leans against her sister's knee, already half asleep, her face glowing amber in the firelight. Hunger still clings to these children, visible in their slender wrists, narrow shoulders, and swift attention to the bowls and crusts before them. Yet tonight, that hunger has retreated just enough to make room for something else. Curiosity, drowsiness, the first whispers of playfulness. Suddenly, someone begins to sing. At first, the voice is neither beautiful nor confident. An older voice, slightly cracked, feeling its way through a familiar tune. Soon, another voice joins in, then another, until a simple melody weaves through the hut. It rises and falls, carried not by skill but by shared memory. It becomes clear. Here, songs survive, not through perfection, but through repetition, with many voices blending so no single weak note can spoil them. Agnes listens silently at first, cradling her bowl with both hands. The firelight warms her face. Without thinking, Will leans against her knee, and she makes no move to discourage him. Occasionally, she breaks off a small piece of bread and passes it to him, or dips the edge into the stew to soften it. There's no sentimentality in her actions, just practical, measured care. Perhaps that is why this gentle tenderness feels more profound than any grand display. The room, though modest, teaches you her quiet economy of gesture. The fire reveals the depth of her kindness. The bowls circulate slowly around the circle. No one gulps hurriedly. The thick pottage demands attention. Grains settle at the bottom, and each person carefully tilts their bowl to savor every last morsel. The taste is smoky, with barley and hints of onion, grounded by the earthiness from the pot itself. Though the meal remains simple and plain, marked by poverty and roughness, it carries substance, and that subtle weight shifts the atmosphere of the evening. Faces soften in the firelight now that their bodies have been fed a little better. No dramatic transformations, just a gradual easing. The skin around mouths relaxes, eyes stop darting toward the next bite. Shoulders drop just an inch or two. Too small a change for anyone to point out, yet enough to feel it. The village is still poor. The villagers are still weary. But for this one evening, a quiet vitality dwells closer to the surface. Perhaps this is what safety looks like in a world shaped by hardship. In the Middle Ages, protection doesn't come from towering walls or abundant stores, nor from nights unbroken by fear. Instead, what people find is a fleeting relief, a brief pause between waves of anxiety. It's a shared meal that asks no one to count the grains left until dawn, a fire large enough for all to gather around, and a song that gently pushes back the darkness, making it feel less filled with dread. Joy during this era rarely means plenty. Rather, it is that momentary permission to simply breathe. This is why such moments feel fragile, yet whole at the same time. No one here thinks tonight has erased their troubles. Taxes will demand payment again. Illness might return. Fields may fail once more. Winter hasn't been banished, nor hunger defeated. But for now, these harsh realities have receded just enough to allow people to remember themselves as more than bodies worn down by hardship. After enduring so much hunger, even a small piece of bread and the warmth of fire take on a sacred quality. A bowl held carefully in both hands becomes more than a vessel. A crust passed without hesitation transforms into something deeply meaningful. The fire offers not just heat but a witness to their shared endurance. Children dozing by the glow and the song stand as living proof that for this moment, life has chosen continuation rather than collapse. The entire village seems wrapped in this silent, unspoken hope. Later, as the fire dwindles and bowls empty, people slowly begin to drift back toward their huts. Not hurriedly, no one rushes to leave the warmth, but gradually, as if reluctant to shatter the gentle spell the evening has woven. Agnes stands with Will leaning heavily against her side, full from food, warmth, and the weight of exhaustion. Tom's voice still carries, and Marjorie laughs softly at some quiet joke no one else quite caught. The fire's flame shifts and settles, glowing red at its core. Around it, the village softens, dims, returning to its familiar self. Yet not every person of this time is shaped only by fields and huts. Some are claimed much earlier by war. A boy of 7 stands, a bow taller than he is held firmly in his hands. That's the first thing that strikes you, even before you notice the mud clinging to his clothes, the cold air, or the restless line of boys shifting nervously in the village square after Mass. The bow is not child's play. It isn't a small wooden imitation meant to make him feel included among men. It is real wood, carrying real weight and strain, already bearing the cruel shape of future pain. When placed in his hands, that bow feels less like a gift and more like a sentence handed down too soon. The morning is damp, in the way village mornings often are. The sky hangs uncertain, neither raining nor dry, trapped in a halfway light that refuses to decide. The church bell's toll has just faded into silence. Villagers who only an hour ago bowed their heads and clasped their hands in solemn prayer now assemble in a different formation. Fathers clustering near the back, older boys lining up loosely in a row, and little ones nudged forward more by tradition and expectation than any real confidence. The ground beneath them is churned and sodden. Mud clings stubbornly to shoes and hems. Nearby, a few hens peck aimlessly at the edge of the square, as if the king's law holds no sway over their carefree world. But for the boys, this is a matter of grave concern. Every able-bodied male is summoned. It's a clear, unyielding law, simple in words, but heavy in burden. Practice isn't leisure here. It's duty. The king demands archers, and such demands are enforced through village squares. Bruised fingers and fathers who don't pause to ask if a son is ready before thrusting a bow into his hands. Absence means fines. Neglect brings punishment and shame. It's a relentless force that fills the spaces official law cannot touch. The boy stands in line because he has no choice. His face still holds a softness, a hint that another world might have allowed him more years of running wild, climbing high, and being foolish for no reason beyond joy itself. But in this world, choices narrow swiftly. His morning tunic is too thin against the chill. His shoes are worn and ill-suited for the clinging mud. And when his hands close around the bow, they still betray the lingering traces of childhood. Not quite smooth, as village children never are, but not yet hardened into the tools of duty. His father stands with him briefly, just long enough to hand over the bow, to press a firm hand to the boy's shoulder and turn him toward the range. Just long enough to murmur some variation of what every father here knows to say without softness. Stand straight. Hold firm, don't shame me, don't shame us. The words shift, but the weight behind them remains unchanged. There is no need for cruelty. The law's severity has already done that job. Ahead, the targets await, nothing grandiose, mere bundles of straw, rough circles marked on the ground, spots where countless missed arrows have sunk quietly into the mud. The older boys stand with more ease, though comfort eludes them still. Their bows demand strength and endurance, and their arms bear the faint marks of this struggle. Yet they have learned the posture, the placement of feet, and how to shield their faces from quick reddening with embarrassment. But the youngest boys, they have yet to learn. The trainer paces along the line with a patience so thin it barely deserves the name. He is no hero, no knight shining in armor. He's just a village man, temporarily in charge, used to wielding his small authority. His beard is patchy and unkempt, his boots muddy and soaked through. His voice carries the flat, rough scrape of someone who's spent years shouting over storms, bad posture, and lurking fear. Pausing before the boy, he nods toward the bow. Raise it. The boy attempts to obey. His struggle isn't about bravery, but about size and balance. The bow is enormous, unwieldy. His arms are short, his shoulders narrow. He lifts it awkwardly with both hands, nearly turning around as the bottom limb brushes close to the mud. A few older boys smirk, not cruelly, but with a fleeting relief that, for once, someone else is the smallest person in the yard. The trainer offers no smile. Again, he commands. The boy repositions his feet, as he's seen. Others do, mimicking form without yet understanding its purpose. He tightens his grip, feeling the cool, smooth wood under his fingers in some spots, rougher in others, and it's heavier than he ever imagined such a bow could be. This time, he manages to get it upright. A small victory. The trainer steps back. Now draw, everything changes here. Lifting the bow is clumsy, but drawing it is personal, revealing exactly where the boy's body is weak. He hooks his fingers on the string and pulls, or tries to. The string resists, indifferent, not mocking, not angry, simply unmoved by a weakness. His elbow jerks outward, his shoulder rises too high. The bow tips precariously. The string moves back only an inch or two before slipping free with a snap that leaves a red stripe across his skin. He doesn't cry, and that is important, not because he lacks pain. He does. The hurt is sharp, humiliating, and a little too public. But village boys learn quickly which pains must be swallowed silently. He presses his lips tight, staring at the ground, not out of shame exactly, but to hold the feeling steady before it spills over. This time, laughter breaks out, not loud, but enough. One older boy snorts quietly, another mutters something too low to catch. The trainer's mouth sets hard, again, and so the relentless rhythm begins. Lift, grip, pull, fail, adjust, try, lose the string, flinch, shift feet, draw wrong, feel the fire. Off to the side, the father stands watch, arms crossed, his face unreadable, a typical expression men adopt when they decide emotions would be wasted. What truly matters to him isn't how he feels, but who the boy is destined to become. Near the church wall, two officials from the royal manor engage in quiet conversation. Their attention lacks because their power guarantees their position regardless of how this lesson unfolds. Their mere presence, however, commands attention. Everyone in the square understands why this training is happening and for whose sake. Before the boy even draws the bow properly, his fingers bleed. A thin crack opens on the skin of one fingertip where the string presses against it. Not badly, just enough to sting with every attempt. The mud beneath him thickens with each movement. His wrists tire relentlessly. His back, still too slight and undeveloped for such work, trembles under the strain of holding the bow steady, even when no further strength remains to pull it any farther. The laughter that had once bubbled around him fades, replaced by fatigue. Even the older boys, recalling their own first days, no longer find amusement in his struggle. Still, the trainer remains unimpressed. He steps forward once to correct the boy's elbow, once more to push the shoulder lower, then once again to lightly strike the boy's foot, demonstrating where true balance lies. There is no kindness here, but nor is there needless cruelty. Medieval instruction rarely afforded such luxuries. It is practical, impersonal, treating the child as unfinished material to be shaped. Finally, the arrow is set, a real arrow this time, though whether the boy feels honored or burdened by this is unclear. The shaft rests awkwardly against the bow, wobbling slightly. The fletching brushes his hand nervously. The target ahead seems impossibly distant, not because of actual length, but because his body has yet to learn how to send anything of itself that far. Draw. The trainer commands again. The boy pulls the string a little farther this time, just enough for strain to gather in his chest and shoulder, enough for the bow to transform from a mere object to a demanding force. His fingers shake, jaw tightening, though the string doesn't reach the proper mark, not even close. It stretches far enough so that effort becomes visible. The trainer gives no praise. Such encouragement is a luxury reserved for success, not beginnings. Loose. The arrow flies, but poorly. It drops almost immediately into the mud a short distance ahead, too embarrassed to even miss properly. Some boys look away. One coughs to mask a laugh. The father closes his eyes briefly, then opens them again, steady and unreadable. But something vital has occurred. The arrow moved, not gracefully or with pride, but it moved. The bow responded. However reluctantly, the square had posed its question, and the boy's body gave the only answer it could. Not enough, but not none. For many boys in the medieval world, duty arrived long before strength did. This is the cruel truth beneath it all. The law makes no allowances for broadening shoulders. Hunger waits for no child's growth to end. The village does not say, "Come back when your hands are bigger," when your fingers no longer bleed, when your pride can withstand the judgment of older boys. No, it demands now. It demands in the mud after church, while the child is still young enough to feel the injustice of the demand, yet old enough to be punished for resisting. And so, the body begins, slowly, painfully, to learn what the world expects. Not in a single morning, not in one tidy lesson, but through a long, grinding series of scratches, trains, corrections, and repetitions. The hands toughen where they were once soft. The shoulders bear effort long before they learn grace. The spine adopts postures it would never have chosen on its own. Even the mind shifts, adjusting to a world where praise is scarce. Pain serves as instruction, and duty presses on whether one is ready or not. By the end of the session, the boy can barely feel his fingertips. Mud has risen to stain the hem of his tunic. The bow leaves a deep imprint, both in the muscles of his arm and even deeper within his pride. He returns the bow awkwardly, only to receive it again because the lesson is not over until the trainer decides. And those men like him usually call an end only when the child understands that stopping is not his choice. Finally, the line breaks. The older boys migrate to one side of the square, flexing sore wrists and exchanging shots with the cautious pride unique to boys eager to boast without seeming to care. Fathers call to their sons. Someone spits into the mud. One of the royal men jots notes on a scrap of parchment, or at least pretends to. Above them, the bell tower stands silent, having long since passed the village from one form of obedience to another. The boy lingers where he stands. His hands ache, his face burns, his body feels freshly and deeply inadequate. Yet beneath that discomfort, somewhere deeper and harder to name, something else has started. Not confidence, certainly not pride, but something tougher and quieter. The first fragile thread of endurance. Because those early humiliations do not disappear. They repeat until repetition itself becomes training. For the archer, the beginning of war is not heralded by screams or battle cries, but by the weight, the enduring burden carried from the very start. Before dawn breaks, while the camp remains shrouded in darkness more than form, and the cook fires barely make a feeble effort against the cold, the horses exhale steam into the chilly morning like restless bellows. The boy has shed his innocence. He is no longer just a boy, though still young enough to be surprised by how much a body can bear before it feels alien. Strapped across his back is the long, familiar bow. Heavy bundles of arrows weigh down his hip and shoulder, their numerous shafts and points transforming every movement into a cumbersome clatter. He wears his quilted gambeson, heavy and awkward, not as sharp as mail but unforgiving nonetheless. Alongside these are a knife, a hammer, a strap, a pouch of wax, spare string, a meager amount of food barely worth mentioning, and water that won't last. Standing fully upright, he is no longer simply one body but a procession of essential burdens tethered to fragile bones. The road claims everything without mercy. Rain has fallen during the night, or perhaps it hasn't ceased for days. Mud clings to every step with a low, persistent hunger, each foot harder to lift than the last. The march follows a rhythm of halt, shift, lurch, and continue. Men cough. Leather groans. Somewhere ahead, a sergeant shouts, because shouting is all he can do to lighten the load others bear. The archers walk bent forward, not by choice but by necessity. Their burdens dictate their posture. The body relearns that much of endurance is simply pushing on after grace has vanished from movement. The arrows are the heaviest burden. Subtle yet relentless, not because they are unfamiliar, but because of their sheer number. They jab the thigh when the path turns rough. Their fletching brushes the side with a dry whisper. Their pointed heads pulled down with unyielding pressure. What was once mere ammunition now feels like a second, poorly attached skeleton. The boy, now old enough to see himself as one with his bow, adjusts the bundle for the 100th time, finding no real relief. The war hasn't even started, and already his body is redefined by function. Rain drifts in and out. Sometimes it is a mist settling into fabric until the cloth surrenders, becoming a cold weight. Other times it sharpens into a needle-like downpour, soaking the gambeson and making his upper body clammy beneath its quilted layers. Protecting the bowstring is a constant, nagging thought. Dry string, dry bow, dry enough to be ready when needed. His mind narrows with the march, letting go of any thoughts of glory, if such thoughts ever surfaced. Instead, it focuses on leather, mud, strap placement, wet hemp, aching shoulders, and whether the campfire at night will be large enough to steam the damp from his padding before morning returns it again. When the camp finally appears, it is never quite rest. This is no resting place. It's merely a pause in the march, a shift from one kind of discomfort to another. Men collapse onto the ground, not out of relief, but because there's nowhere else to be. Fires flicker to life or are kept strictly forbidden, depending on the fear of enemy scouts lurking nearby. Bread is broken, but it disappoints. Dry, insufficient. Water is gulped down too fast, already failing to slake the thirst. Boots come off for inspection, earning curses before being shoved back on weary feet. Somewhere nearby, a man laughs, too loudly, at nothing, and someone else remains utterly silent. The archer's hands move with practiced care, checking his bow, scrutinizing the string, quivering over the arrows. Tomorrow may bring chaos, but at least this must stay possible. Around him, others repeat the ritual. Maintaining their gear becomes a form of prayer, a desperate hope in a world where simple prayer alone feels like poor odds. The battlefield reveals itself little by little before they step onto it. Not all at once, but in fragments. A gentle rise here, a hollow there. Stakes hammered deep into earth. Horses stamp anxiously beneath riders, a class and wealth far beyond those trudging on foot. Banners ripple in a wind that feels more like the echo of history than a passing breeze. Archers stretch their line wider. The enemy lies ahead, at first no more than a distant shimmer. The boy, once small, now grown into the frame shaped by his bow, takes his place among others who seem less like heroes and more like laborers lined up for danger. One of battle's great oddities is how much waiting it demands. Orders trickle down the line in fragments. Adjust there. Hold here. Not yet. Men shift weight uneasily. Some murmur prayers, cross themselves, or glare ahead so intently it's as if their bodies stand empty shells. The archer feels his old training awaken, not as courage, but as a sequence. Grip, set, draw, hold, loose. His body remembers the language of this work even when his mind yearns for silence. Then it begins. The first volley bursts forth, not with poetry, nor the grandeur later stories would assign it. Just a command, a motion, 100 bowstrings straining into a singular jagged sound, and the air darkens as arrows, crafted to pierce flesh, arc upward, vanish into distance and sky, then plunge where men and horses struggle to remain more than casualties. Again and again, the volleys thunder. The archer's body moves quicker than thought. Draw, loose. Draw, loose. Movements once drilled in muddy fields beside village churches now carry weight beyond pride or pain. But the enemy does not stop because arrows exist. This lesson is taught swiftly in war. Men fall, horses rear and panic. The line shudders where strikes find breaks. Yet the relentless push forward, war's brutal persistence, marches onward across ground littered with the fallen. The archer shoots until his aim fades, replaced by a rhythmic endurance pressed under crushing pressure. Fingers sting where calluses split, Shoulders, conditioned yet never truly prepared, throb with familiar burn. Arrows dwindle. The gap closes, then. The face of battle shifts. What had once been a matter of distance now became a matter of proximity. The battle line bent and buckled somewhere amid the chaos. Men-at-arms surged forward or recoiled backward. It hardly mattered from the archer's vantage point. Suddenly, the first enemy close enough to see their face jolted him sharply. No matter how many warnings or drills he had endured, his bow, so formidable at a distance, now seemed unwieldy, fragile, and far too slow for the brutal intimacy of close quarters. The final arrow was released almost without thought or aiming, and then his hands grasped something else, knife, hammer, buckler, anything capable of facing the overwhelming nearness with more than just disbelief. Close combat was far less heroic than it was clumsy and raw. There was mud underfoot, slipping and sliding, the sound of heavy breathing mingled with impacts lacking any elegance. Bodies charged into spaces no body should enter. A shield's edge clanged. A blow glanced off armor. Men collapsed not like knights in heroic ballads, but like empty sacks of labor dropped without warning. The archer survived not by becoming a skilled swordsman, but because everyone nearby was caught in their own private maelstrom of panic, weight, training, confusion, and noise. He struck only when absolutely necessary, ducked too late at times, and felt a burning line cut across his arm. The cacophony of shouted commands blurred into incomprehension. Somehow, he found himself still standing, then down, only to rise again because the ground offered less safety than the peril it concealed. When the battle finally began to thin, calling what remained a victory felt inadequate. The battlefield was transformed beyond recognition, pocked with stakes, mud, broken bodies, shattered shafts, abandoned equipment, and horses wailing in haunting cries that no one could forget once heard. Men who had been archers were now simply survivors, or at times not survivors at all. The archer gathered his bow, reluctant to leave it behind despite its battered state. One limb caked with mud, and the string slackened by dampness and strain. He held it with a near tenderness, not out of affection, but out of acknowledgement. This piece of crafted wood had carried him from training grounds to battlefield, from child to instrument, from repetitive practice into the harsh reality of consequence. Then the wound began to make its voice known more plainly. What had been a dull heat during the battle now sharpened into pain. Whether cut by blade, pierced by bolt, or struck by less lethal force, the arm stiffened painfully. Dark blood seeped through cloth. The shoulder, twisted or struck, hung heavy and burdensome. Breathing became a fight as ribs protested each motion. The body, which had kept itself moving out of sheer urgency during the fight, now began reckoning the damage in the heavy, slower language of aftermath. Men were gathered together or dragged away. Calls for water rang out. Stretchers appeared as they could. Where none existed, human hands became makeshift carriers. The surgeon's tent stood as a grim chamber fashioned from dread and absolute necessity. Canvas replaces wattle, but the harsh realities remain unchanged. Pain lingers, as does a gripping uncertainty. The smell here is worse than that of the battlefield, more intimate, mingled with blood, wine, old cloth, sweat, and the faint presence of infection already taking root in the wounds of men who are yet unaware they've been claimed by it. Nearby, the archer sits or lies, or is lowered onto a bed of straw, hearing others long before he fully sees them. Groans rising softly, the sibilant hiss of wine poured where it's least wanted, the scrape of tools against bone and flesh. Voices rise. Hold him, too deep. Next. This is the grim chorus of survival. When the surgeon finally gazes upon the wound, it is with a relentless, brutal clarity. There is no room left for gentleness in his work. Cloth is sliced away, revealing raw flesh. Wine burns fiercely as it is doused over the open wound, and for a brief, agonizing moment, the archer's entire world contracts into this single, sharp torment. The body instinctively recoils, but is powerless to turn from itself. Stitching follows, pressure is applied, or a healing paste is generously spread where hope battles against decay. In a shadowed corner, another man is worse off, while somewhere behind, a silence falls, a silence too heavy, telling its own grim tale. Glory is far from the archer's mind now. All he can think about is staying whole enough to rise again, or if rising is beyond reach, at least to cling to life long enough to be counted among the living once more. Survival after battle carries a hollow weight. It is no triumph, it is subtraction. The world's noise has fled, leaving behind a silence wearied beyond meaning peace. The survivors gaze at each other, unsure what fragments remain intact, whether a stitched arm, a damaged shoulder, a limp, a bow still functional, or a burdened memory too heavy for the next march. The body that returns from war is not the one that marched in, even if no limb is lost. Something fundamental has shifted in its very composition. War does not bestow glory upon the archer. It bends him between usefulness and injury. This is the true outcome. Training delivered as promised. The body drew the bow. The arrows flew. The battlefield was endured and survived. But survival wears no crown instead. It demands a new way of carrying yourself. A shoulder that aches without relief. Fingers that stiffen in the cold. A back that aches with every mile of the march when the rain returns. Even deeper lies a strange void when danger ceases. Because the body was so tightly focused on a singular purpose that ordinary life now almost feels surreal. And when the battle's clamor finally fades, all that remains is a weary body craving silence. Not glory, not songs, not the chatter of kings, victories, or banners, only silence, dry cloth. A place to sit where armor doesn't bite into bone. A fire, if there is one. Sleep, if it comes. This desire is smaller than ambition, yet older. A simple wish of flesh to rest from being needed, even for a time. This longing for warmth and quiet ushers in another world. One entirely medieval, the world of night. Evening arrives in a castle slowly, but never gently. As dusk fell, the light at the castle windows faded first, thinning into gray before vanishing completely from the glassless openings. The stone around them grew colder, shadows thickened in the corners, and the ceiling beams disappeared into the dark above. Long corridors that had only seemed dim an hour earlier became uncertain, then watchful, and finally felt bottomless. Darkness within a castle was not emptiness. It had substance. It gathered in stairwells, hid beneath tables, lingered in alcoves, curled along curved walls, and filled along the lofty timbered spaces above the hall where even daylight struggled to reach. Left unanswered, the darkness would claim the castle, room by room. But the castle resisted, not with a single source of light, but many, each bearing its own purpose, cost, and place in the hierarchy of illumination. Lighting a castle was a negotiation with the night, a gradual pushback in layers. The grandest of these lights was beeswax. Before the candles were even fully seen, their presence was known through a distinctive scent, not sweet, but clean, sharply contrasting with the smells of smoke, damp rushes, kitchen grease, and the usual roughness of medieval air. Beeswax candles burned with a steady, clear glow, unlike lower quality candles that smoked and filled the air with a greasy discomfort. When the first flame touched the wick, the light rose small and controlled, then settled into a warm, patient, and almost noble radiance. In the great hall, just a few beeswax candles transformed everything. Where there had once been shadowed masses, tables became recognizably wooden again. Goblets revealed their rims. Hands appeared, faces took shape, first near the flame, then further away, until the room acknowledged it was inhabited. More candles conveyed more than mere utility. Placed in holders along tables, on sideboards, near the Lord's seat, or clustered in a hanging frame above a feast, they proclaimed wealth even before a word was spoken. Wax cost money. Honey required hives. Hives meant land, labor, caretakers, time, and a whole chain of effort beyond the flame itself. To burn beeswax in quantity was a silent declaration of the ability to afford elegance amid the darkness. Tallow candles told a different story. They served the same function but lacked the refinement of beeswax. Made from rendered animal fat, tallow candles smoked more, flickered and sputtered, and carried a scent that reminded everyone a little too vividly of their material origin. Where beeswax granted a hall, a ceremonial air, tallow made the space merely functional. It allowed servants to repair, stewards to count, children to catch the edges of their bowls before tipping them. Tallow was not admired, yet it was indispensable, sustaining the practical need of medieval life more than the admired once ever could. The distinction between these two types of candles was about much more than scent or light quality. It was fundamentally about social status. Imagine the way light was used in a medieval castle, a clear reflection of status and purpose. A lord's dining hall might be illuminated by the soft, warm glow of beeswax candles, exuding an air of refinement. Meanwhile, a humble kitchen boy may do with the harsher flicker of tallow candles, practical but far less elegant. Even sacred spaces had their own light. Chapels were often bathed in cleaner, purer illumination, ensuring holiness was seen properly and with reverence. In the noble chambers, a few flames carefully arranged could cast a gentle, inviting glow, while workrooms suffered under the uneven, smoky dance of many candles struggling to keep the dark at bay. Light wasn't just functional, it was a subtle marker of rank and privilege. Darkness was the universal backdrop, but how fiercely one resisted it said a great deal. Then there were oil lamps, belonging to a quieter, more reserved world than the blazing bravado of candles. An oil lamp didn't demand attention. It took its place quietly on a table or in a corner and offered a steady, unwavering glow. These lamps might be fashioned from humble clay, robust metal, or well-worn pottery darkened by years of use. Inside, the oil rested silently, drawn upward by a wick into a flame less flamboyant than a torch and often more enduring than a candle's flicker. In warmer regions, olive oil provided a luxurious fuel. In colder climates farther north, animal or fish oils were the practical choice. Less fragrant, maybe, but no less effective. Oil carried its own quiet authority. Its strength was endurance that mattered deeply in private chambers, chapels, or long corridors, where someone might move after dark. An oil lamp offered reliability a great hall's grand spectacle could match. One could refill the lamp, trim its wick, set it down and trust it to burn steadily, not forever, but long enough to illuminate a stretch of important darkness. Lamps were intimate lights, thinking lights. They made reading possible if anyone was literate and able, and transformed vast stone castles into smaller, more bearable worlds. Torches, on the other hand, told a different story. They were bold and unmissable, announcing their presence with crackling sounds, sharp smells, and fierce brightness. Made from resinous wood, carefully prepared to burn fiercely, A torch was literally a moving flame. In the hands of a guard stationed on the wall, a torch's purpose was not comfort. It was exposure, warning, and illumination in places where fixed light wouldn't reach. Torches pushed back the dark aggressively along stairs, in gatehouses, and through corridors with a power no candle could match. But their wild energy came at a price. Sparks, smoke, dripping pitch, the constant threat that the very light keeping the castle safe could set it alight. This gave torches a clear place in the hierarchy of light. They were excellent for movement, vigilance, and dramatic display in public spaces, outdoors, in processions, or on patrol. But torches were ill-suited for delicate chambers filled with fabric, books, carved wood, or anyone who hoped to keep their sleeves unburned. These flames belonged to the muscular, public side of castle illumination, the side that guarded, announced, and impressed. Beneath and around all these flames, more constant than any handheld light, stood the ever-present hearth, the fireplace. Not every medieval room could boast a true hearth, but where it existed, its role went far beyond mere illumination. It warmed the cold stone, which otherwise bore the bitter memory of winter's chill. It dried damp cloth and fueled the processes of baking, boiling, roasting, and steaming. More importantly, it gathered people around it, not for show, but for fundamental survival and connection. In great halls, a hearth turned an enormous, drafty chamber into a place that briefly mirrored communal life. In private chambers, it shrank the vast world down to a comforting circle of warmth and flickering light. In kitchens, the fire was relentless labor incarnate, not a decorative feature. It was the essential force that sustained daily life. The light from a fireplace was a world apart from candlelight. It was less exact, yet more dynamic and alive. The flames cast broad, breathing shadows that danced and shifted across walls, making faces glow from below before retreating again into darkness. This light reminded everyone present that heat and flame were still wild and untamed forces, not fully subdued by stone or iron. Paradoxically, it was this unpredictability and vitality that people cherished. It made a room feel held, anchored. But all this glowing warmth and light came at the cost of constant, unseen labor. It's easy to romanticize the medieval glow, forgetting none of it was self-sustaining. Someone had to tend bees for their wax, render fat into usable fuel, trim candle wicks, store candles carefully, carry and place them, and rekindle flames when drafts or carelessness quenched them. Lamps demanded refilling, soot had to be cleaned, old wax scraped away, torches prepared, wood hauled, split, stacked, fireplaces fed, and ashes emptied, day after day. The brighter and more impressive the illumination, the greater the hidden labor supporting it, forming an invisible architecture beneath daily life. Servants moved tirelessly through this unseen world. A boy carried a taper, lighting one candle from another. A woman brought fresh wood before the hearth's glow faded too low. A steward inventoried supplies, already calculating what stores might last through winter against the demands of feast days. Hands wiped oil from metal lamps before grime thickened it into dirt, while others carefully trimmed wicks so flames burned cleanly, enough to flatter the room's appearance rather than merely reveal it. Managing light required the same meticulous care as managing food, textiles, and labor. It was a task marked by careful attention, inequality, and a constant evaluation of both practicality and symbolic meaning. Because light in the Middle Ages was never solely about practicality. It was also comfort, status, labor, and display. Burning more light than strictly necessary was a deliberate statement, Enduring poorer or meager lighting was often a reflection of one's social station. Gathering in the warmest glow was an admission of humanity's enduring bond with fire, not just for vision, but for the profound feeling of being less alone in the encompassing darkness. That is why a single candle flickering on a roughly hewn table and 50 candles illuminating a vast hall were connected, despite the gulf of wealth between them. Both embodied the same human need to find warmth and companionship amid the shadows. Throughout history, people have confronted the same deep-seated fear. Night, when left to its own, is vast and overwhelming, too immense for humans to inhabit comfortably. Some met this challenge with the soft glow of beeswax candles and careful polishing. Others relied on the modest flicker of tallow and practiced tolerance for the dark. Some trusted oil lamps, some brandished torches, while others depended on a hearth that seemed never to rest. Yet, beneath all these varied responses lay a shared struggle, a negotiation against the blackness pressing relentlessly against walls and windows. Every flicker of light, whether majestic or modest, represented a common purpose, more bearable, to claim a small haven of warmth and safety amid the encompassing dark. Imagine a servant carrying a lamp across a quiet corridor, a guard lifting a torch shielded from the wind, a lord dining by the gentle glow of beeswax candles, a cook leaning over hot coals, or a child mesmerized as the firelight dances upon the walls while sleep quietly draws near. Each, within their station, was engaged in the same act, pushing back the night's shadow in whatever way their medieval world allowed. From these humble lights, we can gradually step deeper into the unique rhythms of medieval night itself. Once the evening's lively work and festivities conclude, a castle doesn't plunge into silence suddenly. Instead, it quiets slowly. Step by step, the great hall is the first to let go of its voices. One bench is drawn back. A final cup is set down. A servant crosses the rush-strewn floor carrying a stack of wooden trenchers. A lord withdraws to a more private chamber where the fire burns lower and the light softens. Candles burn down. Lamps are carefully trimmed. The warm public space of the evening gradually divides into smaller, more intimate circles, doorways, corners, and separate rooms where night's long hours might be endured with modesty. Outside the walls lies the courtyard, washed in a different kind of light. When the moon rises fully, its pale light bears no resemblance to flame. It offers no flattering warmth, no flickering comfort. Instead, it lays a patient, silver hand across stone, softening steps, cisterns, archways, and the wet curve of roof tiles. It turns puddles into dim mirrors, and the edges of battlements into something both purer and more distant. Guards on the wall appear taller beneath moonlight, yet less human, reduced to shadowy shapes moving against a pale sky. Under a full moon, the castle's outer spaces can feel unexpectedly spacious, as though the night has opened up instead of closing down. But moonlight is unreliable. A passing cloud can change the courtyard in an instant. Corners disappear. Stone fades into darkness. Distances shrink. A doorway that moments before seemed safe now hints at something lurking. Thus, the moon is not a tool for medieval life, but a guest. Welcomed when present, observed when absent, yet never trusted enough to structure household plans around. That critical task falls instead to the smaller, steadier lights. Rush lights belong to the quieter, humbler hours of the night. They are simple, slender, no thicker than a finger, and made from dried rushes soaked in grease. These are not grand flames. They burn cheaply and briefly, meant for those who need light but cannot afford anything more elaborate. Their aroma is faintly oily, their glow modest, and their lifespan frustratingly short. Yet, despite their limitations, rush lights endure in places where extravagance would be out of place. A servant's corner, a narrow hallway, a kitchen workbench, or a small room where someone is mending clothes before bedtime. A rushlight never aims to conquer the darkness. Instead, it offers a small truce with it, held in the hand. This tiny light makes the immediate world feel close and personal. The next few steps ahead, the edge of a stair, the clasp of a chest, the hem of a garment awaiting stitches, or the face of someone still awake later than expected. Beyond this circle of light lies shadow. But the darkness is easier to accept when the nearby surroundings have been named again by the light. This is how the castle eases into night, not by falling into silence abruptly, but by softening room by room. A lamp is lowered. A rush light is kindled from the dying flame of the last good candle. A servant moves steadily through a corridor where only one small pool of light breaks up the long stretches of cold gray stone. In the chapel, embers faintly glow, casting a dull red shimmer across the floor. In the kitchens, the great blazing fires die down to a practical low warmth. In chambers, cloaks are shaken out, shoes set aside, and shutters closed where shutters exist. Night does not halt life. It rearranges it, then comes sleep, or rather, the first sleep. This distinction matters. Medieval people often saw night not as one uninterrupted descent into unconsciousness, but as divided into phases, not due to problems, but simply by custom. They would sleep deeply for a few hours after evening, then wake in the middle of the night, and later return to rest again before dawn. To modern eyes, this pattern might seem broken, inconvenient, or strange. To those who lived it, it was simply the natural rhythm night allowed. The first sleep pulls the body down swiftly after a day of work, firelight, and food. After the long negotiations of daylight turning into evening, the body yields without resistance. It sinks into straw, blanket, or mattress if one is available. Muscles relax, fingers unclench, breathing slows and deepens. The room itself, indifferent as ever, receives the weight of the sleeping, whether lord in fine linen or servant in coarse wool, and all vanish into the same embracing dark, though rarely with equal comfort. Then, sometime in the deep night, waking returns, not with violence or suddenness, and not always completely. Sometimes it's a gentle shift of blankets, other times the faint feeling that the fire's glow has dimmed. Occasionally, a body, trained by years to divide the night, rises toward consciousness on its own accord. This waking is unique, softer than morning, less burdened than dawn. The day hasn't yet begun. No fields call, no bells ring, darkness still clings, but it no longer feels strange. It has already been experienced once. This middle waking holds its own quiet significance. A man might stir the dying embers, warming his hands. A woman quietly checks on a sleeping child. A servant carries a lamp down a corridor, tends to a minor task, then disappears back into the less important darkness beyond. Someone drinks water. Another prays. Someone pulls a cloak closer and sits. Not because sleep has fled, but because the night itself offers a pause. In kitchens and service chambers, this is often when the smallest labors continue. Dough left to rest is examined. A pot is carefully shifted. Ashes are tended. A cup is rinsed. A scrap of cloth is mended by faint light, while the rest of the household stays folded in deeper darkness. These hours aren't busy, they're soothing. The work is slight, almost secret, and utterly ordinary. The night softens the world, allowing even labor to soften into quietude. The fires add their own quiet companionship. A midnight hearth is different from one at supper. The flames no longer leap or dance. They settle into embers and glowing seams beneath darkening logs. Their light is weaker, but somehow kinder. It demands no attention, but allows it. Sitting by the coals, one feels neither entertained nor impressed, only accompanied. The room grows quieter. The body slows. Even thought drifts more gently in this dim light. Outside, moonlight may still drape over the stones if the sky is clear. A guard passes with measured steps, his figure crossing silver light before vanishing into a tower's shadowed entrance. Somewhere above, a shutter taps once in the wind. Below, a hound stirs in sleep. The whole castle feels less like a machine of rank and duty, and more like a layered being in temporary suspension, not dead, not fully asleep, just subdued. This is why the night feels lived in, not empty. There's space for waking without panic, for small acts without urgency, for darkness that's not always an enemy but a condition one learns to inhabit. The night encompasses first sleep, middle waking, second sleep. It holds embers, whispered voices, stairwells, moonlight, grease-scented rushlights, and the modest rhythms of those who have long stopped expecting perfect comfort from the world. For medieval people, sleep wasn't broken. It was simply another rhythm of living. There was a rhythm that the body instinctively understood. Sleep, wake briefly, tend the fire, whisper a prayer, meet a need, and then return to bed. There was no sense of crisis, no modern idea of insomnia. Instead, the night was divided by its own deep and natural logic. The long hours of darkness demanded more from people than today's nights do, and yet people answered not with complaint, but with ritual and custom. Once the darkness was accepted instead of resisted, the night began to feel almost like a companion. Perhaps that was its most peculiar gift. The corridor no longer held fear after crossing its silence enough times. The yard, lit by moonlight, grew familiar. The faint glow of embers in the hearth became a quiet assurance rather than a weak remnant. Even those brief awakenings in the middle of the night ceased to feel like interruptions. Instead, they transformed into small private chambers of stillness nestled within the night itself, cozy spaces between two sleeps. When the time came for second sleep, it arrived more gently. The body sank again into wool, straw, feathers, or fur. The rushlight was snuffed out. The lamp was trimmed lower. The fire was left to hold on to whatever warmth it could muster. The room didn't vanish into emptiness, but softened into rest. Outside, stones either held onto the moonlight or faded from it. Inside, breaths lengthened and found harmony in the dark. But not every night belonged to rest. In another part of the medieval world, a different room stayed awake for suffering, for experimentation, and for desperate hope. This room was too crowded for true healing and too small to permit doubt, yet doubt lived there all the same. In its center stood Henrik, clutching a knife in one hand and a borrowed certainty in the other, two things that in this place were nearly indistinguishable. If anyone called this room a surgery room, it was a rough corner of the monastery where stone walls held the cold like a second skin, and the ceiling trapped every smell instead of letting any escape. Blood, damp wool, old straw, smoke, sweat, sour wine, and beneath all these, a sharper scent, the early warning sign of flesh turned bad. A torch burned poorly in an iron bracket, while another had already guttered, leaving one side of the room in restless half-shadow. Faces appeared and disappeared depending on how the weak flame flickered. Henrik did not look like a man born into authority, only a man who had decided he could not wait for better conditions. His tunic was stained at the cuff. His fingers were red from cold and roughened by work demanding impossible precision with insufficient tools. The knife he held had been sharpened many times, sometimes poorly. Beside him, on a cloth, lay other tools, ambitious but unruly: hooks, thread, a small saw, a needle blackened at the eye, and cloths that had been washed but never truly made innocent again. Around him a crowd watched, breathing with the low hunger of people who had come not only seeking help, but also to witness. A wounded soldier lies on a makeshift table, a rough board stretched across trestles, officially defined by necessity more than comfort. One leg is bound in cloth, already darkening with blood or infection. Frostbite, crushing injury, or maybe all three combined. In this room, injuries refuse to fit neatly into categories. The man's face gleams with sweat, even though the biting cold outside seems to chill everyone else's skin. His hands twitch repeatedly, clenching tight, then relaxing, then clenching once more, as though his body can't decide whether to hold on or surrender to the coming dissection. Near the wall, Brother Anselm, a monk, sits quietly, watching and recording everything. Keeps his parchment balanced on his knee, face almost motionless, yet his eyes dart swiftly, counting the things others try to avoid: who survived, who declined, whose wound festered more odiously by the next day, which patient screamed through the blade, and which slipped into eerie silence before the end. He writes, as if continued recording might eventually unravel understanding. Henrik sometimes resents this, perhaps because once numbers are written down, they can't be shouted away or ignored. The cold has chased them all inside, and Henrik has learned to trust it where he can. Snow, scooped from the monastery yard, is brought inside in pails and packed tightly around wounds, pressed against skin already pale with frost's cruel touch. They hold the icy cloth there, believing that dulling sensation might blunt the pain. The soldier groans when the snow first touches his flesh, then gasps sharply before falling into a terrible quiet. The people in the room choose to see this quiet as relief, because they need to believe it means something. Henrik tells himself the same tale. The cold numbs, the cold slows the bleeding, the cold buys him precious time. Sometimes the cold works, sometimes the cutting goes faster afterward. Sometimes the blood flows less urgently. Sometimes the wounded man even survives until morning. And in a place like this, dawn can feel perilously close to a kind of victory. Leaning over the ruined limb, Henrik works within a small pool of light as if sheer concentration might somehow sharpen the blade's edge. His jaw clenches. His breath quickens. One hand lifts, the other slices. A cloth is pressed against the wound. Thread is pulled through flesh in rough, determined stitches. The body on the table jerks with each motion, then settles, then jerks again. No one here expects grace from surgery. What they expect is pain, noise, restraint, the raw spectacle of one person fighting decay before it fully claims them. But pain is not what haunts Henrik the most. Pain is undeniable. Pain screams out, demanding response, whether that be a soothing hand, a bite strap, a whispered prayer, a comforting lie, or a bucket of snow. Pain is, in some strange way, honest. It is what follows pain that unmakes him. By the dim torchlight, the wound appears clean, but come dawn, an unmistakable stench fills the air. The stitches hold, yet beneath the surface, the flesh heats with fever. Yellowish discharge stains the linen. Swelling returns relentlessly. Patience endure the knife's edge, only to be claimed quietly by a foe the blade cannot see. Henrik is beginning to grasp, albeit faintly, that not all his setbacks stem from a lack of courage or speed. Some enemies remain concealed. Some corruption festers beneath the cloth, beneath the healing salve, beyond the assured confidence of every man in the room. Brother Anselm perceives this too, though he names it differently. He never confronts Henrik directly. Instead, when asked, he calmly recites the record in his low, dry voice. Snow applied, bleeding slowed, stitching completed, fever by evening, rot by morning, burial the following day. The words are simple, almost merciful in tone, yet they leave Henrik exposed with no place to hide. A blunt instrument can be blamed. A frail patient can be blamed. Weather can be blamed, but written repetition becomes increasingly impossible to ignore. Still, the room fills once more the next day. Another frost-bitten foot, another crushed hand, smashed in a wagon or mill, another abscess opened too late, another hopeful face brought in, because hope, even when repeatedly disappointed, costs less than surrender. Villagers gather again, some driven by need, some by curiosity, others drawn by suffering's company in times when entertainment is rare and miracles even scarcer. To watch Henrik work is to stand at the fringe between knowledge and ignorance, and many choose to stand on that edge rather than return home and wait for their own turn. Henrik understands the performance at play, though it breeds a quiet self-loathing. He lifts the blade, speaking with a firmness beyond his true feeling. He calls for cloth, for snow, for thread, for stillness. Here, authority is part skill, part theater. If he allowed fear to show, the room's fragile order would unravel. So he does not. He lets them believe his certainty is born of skill, not desperation. Yet every time Brother Anselm's quill scratches parchment, every time a patient worsens for reasons Henrik cannot fully name, that looming shadow creeps back. The greatest terror in medieval medicine is not the pain itself, but the haunting uncertainty of which cure quietly kills the patient. That presence stands beside Henrik in the surgery room, closer than the crowd, nearer than the flickering torch, even nearer than Brother Anselm with his careful records. It is not death itself, too common here to shock anyone, but uncertainty wielded with instruments. Snow that soothes but also harms, wine that cleans yet burns, needles that close wounds and trap corruption beneath, hands that save but unknowingly carry ruin from one body to the next. And still, despite the darkness, every effort begins with the same fragile hope that this time knowledge might prevail. This time the bleeding will stop and stay stopped. This time the fever won't climb again. This time the man laid out on the table will wake up, drink, curse, limp away, and keep on living. The hope Henrik clings to is always small, practical, and stubborn enough to stubbornly return. Without that flicker, he'd set down his knife and let the room fill only with prayers and flies. But in such a place, hope cannot linger in just one form for long. When the snow fails to heal, Henrik's eyes shift elsewhere, to stronger hands, harsher methods, colder water, rougher restraints, odd experiments. The room teaches him no neat lessons, only restless dissatisfaction. That hope morphs constantly, from snow to fists to ropes to ever colder, stranger attempts. Henrik does not become reckless overnight. A reckless plunge would mark a sharp break, a dramatic fall into madness where a sensible man realizes he's gone too far. But Henrik's path drags on slower, more medieval in its cruelty. Each failure leaves behind grief, but also a question. Unanswered questions harden into methods. If snow failed, perhaps the cold wasn't deep enough. If the cutting caused too much pain for the patient to stay still, maybe the pain itself must be broken before the blade can work. If one hand couldn't hold the body quiet, rope might hold better than mercy. Henrik isn't setting out to become monstrous. He simply asserts that each new attempt must differ from the last. At first, the room mistakes his obsession for progress. The crowd always craves new ideas. Novelty flatters the desperate. A surgery room soaked in old blood, old cloth, and old fear can briefly transform through the promise that something different might finally happen there. Brother Anselm notices this before Henrik does. Villagers gather quicker when rumors spread that the surgeon has learned a trick from a traveler, a physician, a butcher, monastery scrolls, battlefields, or some half-remembered tale carried by men who know no more than anyone else. They don't only want healing, they want change. The same wound, fever, and decay become a little easier to bear when wrapped in the language of experiment. It's on one of those days that Otto arrives. He isn't a physician, nor does he look impressive at first glance. Broad-shouldered and thick-handed, he carries the blunt confidence of a man who's broken enough things in life to trust force over finesse. He's worked as a soldier, a drover, perhaps a guard, depending on which version of his past he offers and to whom. What matters to Henrik isn't Otto's history, but his certainty. As he watches a patient thrashing beneath the knife, Otto declares that pain can be solved more simply than all this snow. And prayer. How? Henrik asks. Otto raises a fist. The room laughs at first, because laughter is easier than understanding. But Otto remains expressionless. He explains with stark simplicity. A single well-placed strike can drop a man like an ox, not permanently, just long enough for a fleeting moment of darkness, for the body to separate briefly from its pain. Enough time, perhaps, to operate without the screams, the thrashing, the need for 4 men to restrain one limb while another silently fights nausea in the corner. It is brutal, undeniably, but in this room, dominated by sawing, stitching, and unrelenting struggle for survival, brutality holds little power as an argument. Henrik resists this idea until he faces the next impossible patient. This man on the table is too strong for his own good. Maybe a miller or a carter, his body thick from years of toil and now wild with fear. His leg wound must be cut open to drain its growing corruption. Snow has numbed none of the pain. Wine has only blurred its edges. 3 men hold him down, yet he bucks fiercely, caught between the trap and death itself. Henrik's hands tremble with rage when he finally steps back. Otto raises his fist almost casually. The strike comes faster than anyone expects. A sharp, brutal blow to the side of the jaw. The man's head snaps violently. His body goes slack. Not dead, not broken, just absent for a precious few breaths. The entire room freezes. Even Brother Anselm pauses mid-quill stroke. Henrik, stunned, grateful, and appalled all at once, moves in swiftly before the patient regains consciousness. For a brief moment, it works, and therein lies the danger. The cutting is cleaner now. The man does not scream. His body remains limp long enough for the worst of the task to be completed. When consciousness returns, confusion precedes pain, and confusion can sometimes feel nearly like mercy to those watching. Otto folds his arms, surveying the room with a blunt satisfaction too genuine to mistake for modesty. Henrik says nothing, but the silence itself is a tacit acceptance. This method has entered the room, and it will return. And once it does, refusal becomes difficult. The fist is used again. Then again, not on every patient. Some are too frail, too old, or too near death to trust such a gamble. But for the strong, the thrashing, the fully alive men who make surgery almost impossible, Otto's method becomes another tool in Henrik's rough arsenal. A blow, a collapse, a fleeting window. The crowd, half horrified, half relieved, starts to speak of it as clever rather than the painful interruption it truly is. Yet even this method falls short. Some men don't stay down long enough. Others awake confused and violent. One never wakes properly, and the room must endure the heavy silence that follows, while Otto mutters about weak skulls and bad luck. Brother Anselm records every detail, and Henrik grows sharper, less patient, increasingly convinced that success is always just one new alteration away. Then there's the river. Winter grips the land so fiercely that ice forms a glassy crust along its edges, and even the air above stings the lungs before taking 10 steps. Henrik, the surgeon who places faith in the power of snow, begins to question whether the problem with snow isn't the cold itself, but that it's simply not cold enough. If a numbness dulls pain, he reasons, then maybe a deeper numbness would be even better. A touch of cold can soothe suffering. Perhaps a more intense cold can master it. It's the logic that desperation breeds. When a principle disappoints, you don't abandon it. You overdo it. So, a patient is brought to the riverbank, not in any grand or ceremonial way, nor as part of a public spectacle of cruelty, but with the brisk, practical manner that medieval people often used when doing harsh things. 2 men support the patient under his shoulders. Another holds his feet, and he's tightly wrapped in cloth. Henrik walks beside them, his mind already in the surgery room, envisioning the incision he'll make on a body numbed by the freezing water. The patient is a man named Wilhelm, conscious enough to understand too much, yet not enough to refuse. Waiting for them at the river is the ice doctor, an old man whose weather-beaten face is etched with contempt. Known throughout the region for his odd remedies and frostbite lore, he's a man whose reputation thrives in places where outcomes aren't carefully recorded and confidence masks ignorance. His gaze fixes upon Henrik with blatant disdain, as if accusing the younger man of stealing an old idea, only to misunderstand it in the same breath. Cold keeps rot, he declares. It does not cure fools. Henrik hears the insult but presses on. They lower Wilhelm into the shallow water, bitterly cold enough to steal the breath from everyone watching. Wilhelm thrashes violently, then stiffens, and finally trembles, a shaking so unsettling it unnerves even Otto, who until now has considered most suffering bearable, if it serves a purpose. The small crowd gathered at the river falls silent, caught between hope and fear, their gazes intense and expectant. Henrik struggles with timing, or maybe there's no perfect timing. If too brief, the body remains in pain. If too long, the cold itself begins to steal life slowly. Wilhelm is pulled out half-conscious, his lips tinged blue, skin mottled. A man transformed into a state rather than a person. In the surgery room, he indeed protests less when cut, but the trembling doesn't cease. A strange fever follows, more severe than before, and the surgical wound worsens. By dawn, Brother Anselm writes faster than ever, while Henrik no longer leans over to read. The cold treatment is judged insufficient, not because it failed outright, but because it failed in the wrong way. And so the contemplation continues. If pain can only be briefly stilled by a clenched fist and awkwardly stemmed by a rushing river, then perhaps the very flow of blood should be more directly controlled. A rope, tightly bound above a damaged limb, might lessen bleeding and grant the surgeon greater command over the injury. This idea carries with it a practical dignity from the start. Men understand the power of pressure. Men understand binding. Men know that flow can be altered through force. In the brutal theater of war, a tourniquet can mean the thin line between survival and death. Yet, within Henrik's chamber, every useful tool arrives shadowed by danger. The rope is rough against tender skin that is far thinner than it appears. Wilhelm becomes the subject of the next test, not because Henrik harbors any cruelty toward him, but simply because Wilhelm is still alive, still wounded, and thus available for hope's next incarnation. The rope is wrapped tightly just above the shattered section of his leg and twisted taut with a stick. Slowly, the flesh below pales, and a murmur of approval ripples through the room. There, the bleeding slows. There, time is bought. There, a cleaner field for the knife. But the longer the rope stays tightened, the colder the limb becomes. A chill more absolute than numbness, less a relief than an ominous silence. The assembly responds to each phase as though witnessing the shifting weather deciding a crop's fate. A low murmur as the bleeding slows, a held breath when Wilhelm groans, a flinch at the strange darkening of skin under the rope. Otto nods, approving the firm grip. The ice doctor scoffs, deriding those who, ignorant of flesh, tie limbs like sacks of grain. Brother Anselm remains silent, his quill moving steadily across parchment. Henrik feels every gaze drilling into the back of his neck, but presses on. Stopping now would not erase what had already transpired. This is the bitter fruit of repeated failure. Failure does not always humble a man. Sometimes it turns him into a compulsive seeker. Each unsuccessful cure doesn't signal surrender, but urges the hunt for the right variation. The room becomes a wheel, turning through endless methods. Snow, fist, river, rope, cut, stitch, fever, rot, mourning. Then repeat. To an outsider, it might seem like progress, innovation born from harsh conditions. But what seems like innovation from without often feels like panic from within. Henrik doesn't stride triumphantly from one breakthrough to the next. Instead, he stumbles from one disappointment to the next, desperate to outrun ignorance before it claims another life. Each new procedure is part logic, part stubborn refusal, a refusal to accept how little he truly knows while wielding such lethal tools. The room itself absorbs this tension. Even the sounds change. Shock lessens at strange proposals. Outrage gives way to weary expectation, as if all have accepted that medicine, in this era, is as much about guessing under pressure as it is about skill. And because every failure leads only to the next attempt, the entire ordeal settles into a weary, compulsive rhythm. What makes this scene strangely hypnotic isn't the violence or the blood, but the pattern unfolding before us. The cycle. Try, hope, cut, watch, wait, fail, adjust, and try again. The monk records the events. The crowd leans in with anticipation. Otto mutters under his breath, while the ice doctor shows his scorn. Wilhelm endures the pain. Henrik contemplates it all. The entire grim machinery of medieval medicine turns another notch, labeling it as effort. Finally, a new idea emerges, not from the river or the operating room, but from the warmth of the kitchen fire. By this point, Henrik finds himself unable to sleep well. It's not because the monastery has grown noisier, though it has, nor is it due to the increasing crowd in the surgery chamber, though that is true as well. The real reason lies in the relentless pattern replaying behind his eyes even when his hands lie still. He sees cloth draped over wounds, thread piercing flesh, fever rising where hope once stood. He hears Brother Anselm narrate outcomes in that dry, patient voice, somehow more wounding than outright accusation. Between cases, Henrik often gazes down at his own tools, wondering if the danger he faces stems not just from what he doesn't know, but from what he doesn't know, but from what he repeatedly touches, from one body to the next, without questioning it. That moment of insight comes to him in the kitchen, not during a moment of brilliant study, nor amidst arguments with Otto or the ice doctor's disdain, just within the simple warmth of monastery chores. The steam swirling from a cauldron, a kitchen woman lifting cloth from boiling water with wooden tongs, careful to protect her hands from searing heat. The room smells of broth, smoke, onions, wet wool drying near the hearth, and hot iron. It is simpler than the surgery chamber, yet, in some ways, wiser. Here, cleanliness is constant and demanded, for food admits no compromise. Henrik watches as the cloth rises from the water. It drips and steams, coming out cleaner than it went in. The realization doesn't strike all at once. It creeps forward. What if the wound fails not only because of bad blood, ill luck, foul air, fragile constitutions, divine displeasure, or delayed treatment? What if the cloth itself harbors danger? The needle, the knife, the hands, the threads, the very same rag used to wipe away one man's corruption, then another's wound, then the blade, then the table. The surgery room has long treated visible dirt and invisible hazard as nearly identical, which, in truth, is to treat neither properly. But the kitchen is less proud. It senses filth through smell, residue, and consequence. Boil a cloth, and it changes. Wash a pot, and it changes. Why should the surgery room be exempt from such plain logic? Bringing this thought back, Henrik approaches Brother Anselm first, before speaking to Otto. The monk listens without surprise, which somehow only fuels Henrik's frustration. Brother Anselm flips through the fragile pages of an ancient text, its language slow and distant, echoing from another century. Within its worn lines, he uncovers references to cleansing, heat, wine, and preparation. There is nothing definitive, no law, no commandment, but enough to convince Henrik that this idea is not madness. It's a sense neglected. The monk's face remains calm, but his finger lingers longer on one particular line. Cleaner may not mean cured, Brother Anselm murmurs. No, Henrik replies softly, but dirt certainly hasn't helped. That exchange is their closest brush with hope. When Otto hears the plan, he bursts out laughing, not cruelly, but with the hearty skepticism of a man who trusts brute strength over subtle techniques. You mean to scare the rot away with warm water? Henrik chooses silence. Practical objections rise from others. Boiling water consumes precious time. Firewood demands hard labor. Water must be hauled painstakingly. Cloth deteriorates faster after repeated heating, and a knife exposed to heat too long risks warping. Their tiny surgery room lacks even the barest necessities. Layering more preparations feels almost sacrilegious. In medieval life, good ideas don't flounder because they're foolish. They falter because they are costly. Still, Henrik presses on. He boils the next cloth, then another. Needles are plunged into water heated to a steady rolling boil and extracted with cautious hands. The knife undergoes a more thorough cleaning than usual before being passed close to the fire. Not enough to dull its edge, but enough to alter the ritual. Brother Anselm watches with meticulous focus, more acute than in his usual note-taking. The kitchen woman who assists Henrik mutters, if these men had spent as much effort cleaning as they've wasted praying over bad stitches, maybe they'd all sleep easier. That day, the surgery room carries a different scent. Not. Blood remains blood. Fear remains fear. But steam fills the air. blending with a sharper sense of readiness. Cloths are arranged with greater care. Water is refreshed before clouding. Hands are washed, not by any scientific measure, but with purpose and intention. The crowd notices. Crowds always do when familiar routines shift. They eye the steaming bowls, as villagers once eyed snow, or a clenched fist or icy river water, with a flicker of uneasy excitement. The patient is no miracle, merely the next man in need of treatment. Perhaps this ordinariness is what makes the moment important. Henrik makes the incision. He cleans the wound. He applies the cloth. He stitches the skin closed, outwardly. It mirrors countless procedures before, except now with the added discipline of heat and cleanliness. No divine light beams into the room. No gasps echo. No one rises from the table proclaiming that science has come. The difference reveals itself later, because real change often arrives quietly, delayed and subtle, easily missed by those craving spectacle. This time, the fever doesn't rise quite so fiercely. The wound still aches, oozes, and looms as a threat. Yet it no longer immediately surrenders to that grim certainty. Brother Anselm reads the notes from the next day twice, looking for something missed. Henrik studies the wound's edges intently, as if his focused gaze might transform doubt into proof. Even Otto, who typically trusts fists over philosophy, finds his jokes less spontaneous. One case alone offers little evidence. Henrik understands this well. A second case raises the possibility further. A third unsettles the notion of mere coincidence. Still, the room doesn't suddenly brim with wisdom. Men continue to try. Limbs are still lost. Pain remains widespread. And ignorance still outstrips. But something has shifted. The surgeon's hand remains steady. The knife nearly unchanged. The fear just as present. But one adversary, perhaps, has become a little clearer as it retreats. This breakthrough isn't triumph, but a subtle narrowing of ignorance. That is what lends the moment its true weight, not certainty nor mastery, but the slightest reduction of error. One less chance for rot to take hold in the hidden folds of cloth. One fewer invitation for infection to leap from wound to wound, carried by habits, masked as routine. The room does not become modern overnight. Instead, it becomes just a little less blindly medieval. And so hope returns, not as certainty, but as one fewer reason to despair. Henrik senses this quietly. It's not joy or vindication, only a lightening of a burden he had nearly accepted as everlasting. Brother Anselm writes now with a spark closer to interest than resignation. Otto squints at the freshly cleaned tools, contemplating whether brute force and measured caution might yet coexist in one hand. Even the kitchen seems softer in its relation to the surgeon's room, as if the cauldron and the scalpel have finally acknowledged their place within a shared struggle for survival. From this point, the story's hold loosens, bringing these medieval lives into a gentler reflection. After darkness, what remains isn't comfort exactly. Comfort would be too grand a word, a modern fantasy misplaced upon such rooms and bodies. The huts remain damp. The grain still counted day by day, the bow still heavy in the hand, and heavier in the years it imprints. The castle still depends on fire for its fragile islands of livable night. The surgeon's room stays full of pain, fear, and uncertainty, even if one guess now stands just a touch firmer than the rest. No great transformation rides over the horizon to remake the Middle Ages into an easier age. What remains instead is continuation, a fire breathing gently beneath ash, a bowl held carefully in both hands, a child sleeping despite hunger, a mother counting what must be kept unseen, a boy standing in mud, a bow taller than himself in hand, a man, years on, carrying that bow's shape etched in his shoulders and spine. A servant crossing a dim corridor with a single small light. A monk bending over parchment as the embers fade. Imagine a surgeon pausing, staring into a basin filled with boiled cloth, his mind gripped by a quiet, stunned humility. The kind that comes when one realizes how ignorance can be peeled back, just a little at a time. These images aren't the usual heroic tableau you might expect, yet it is precisely this understated nature that makes them so enduring. History often favors its loudest echoes: kings, banners, battles, grand coronations, bloody massacres, monumental treaties, and names etched in stone by hands guided by others. But the Middle Ages, when lived from within, were often more about small, enclosed spaces and repetitive daily tasks. The smoke curling under wooden beams, mud clinging at doorsteps, wrists aching from labor, dim light barely illuminating the room, food portioned in handfuls, and moments of rest measured only by what could be snatched before the next relentless demand arrived. What lingers first in memory is the humble hut, its damp straw, the cold smoke drifting in. Agnes by the hearth, her hands already busy before dawn had fully settled on the day. Will, lying beneath a threadbare blanket, eyes watchful even through fever. The careful stashing of grain beneath the floorboards, or tucked away beyond the village inside a hollow log, small enough to be overlooked by those who never had to depend on such hiding spots, yet significant enough to shape an entire week for those who did. The pottage thickening slowly, a near miraculous transformation. Bread broken sparingly, just enough to ease the breath. These simple, unassuming scenes are painted in humility, and it is precisely this humility that has kept them alive through the ages. Then there's the boy with the bow, not yet a legend, not a figure in a manuscript's margin, just a child standing in the mud, his shoulders still narrow, bearing the early weight of law already closing in, the bowstring biting into his fingers, older boys chuckling at first, then falling silent. His father nearby, not necessarily unkind, but too burdened by necessity to afford gentleness when utility was demanded, and later, the body sculpted by the bow. One arm more developed, one shoulder enduring constant tension, hands mapped by strain, pain settling into a rhythm, because rhythm was easier to bear than complaint. Even when war arrived, it offered no honor to him, only use. Perhaps this is the truest medieval memory, not of glory won, but of function endured. The castle holds another piece of what remains, not first as splendor, but as darkness resisted. Beeswax candles in the great hall, tallow lamps in the humbler rooms, flickering rush lights held by servants, fireplaces glowing red at their center, edges turned black with smoke, moonlight spilling across stone like a soft veil of distance. The first sleep, waking in the silent hours before dawn, a hand reaching toward fading embers, footsteps crossing corridors and hushed passage. Night accepted, not conquered. There's a tenderness here, though the age may not have had a word for it, a quiet intimacy between human life and the darkness, forged through habit rather than control. And then, finally, the surgery room. Picture the knife, the restless crowd, Brother Anselm scribbling away, Otto's clenched fist, the icy river, and the rope cutting into flesh. Wilhelm, caught between theory and the fragile return to simply being a man. Henrik stands amidst this shattered certainty, trying method after method, not out of love for experimentation, but because people keep arriving with broken bodies, eyes searching for answers that seem to hide within these walls. When a glimpse of an answer finally comes, it arrives quietly, Not with fanfare, but with something as simple as hot water, a clean cloth, and a slightly narrowed ignorance. This is medieval endurance laid bare, stripped of all pretenses. It is not about romance, nor about endless misery. It is something more relentless, more intimate, more tied to the body, and harder to depict honestly. Perhaps that's why it deserves to be remembered more deeply. People woke up in cold, grim rooms and carried on. They measured grain, learned pain early, built whatever warmth they could find. They lit small flames against overwhelming darkness, guessed, failed, adjusted, and guessed again. They didn't conquer life, but they kept living it. True victory was never comfort. It was the sheer act of continuing. One more meal, one more kneel, one more night, one more story, one more dawn. And this is why these harsh lives soften with time. When panic subsides, what remains is not just deprivation, but pattern. The bowl passed from hand to hand, a song by the bonfire, the low fire flickering in a cramped hut, a bowed head carefully waxing a bowstring, a lamp glowing quietly in the corridor, the monk's steady record-keeping, the surgeon's weary hope, the body, always the body, learning how little, learning the next day. With this understanding, even the hardest world begins to take on a gentleness that can be remembered without fear. Not because it was kind, it wasn't. Not because it should be romanticized, it shouldn't. But because memory, slowed and true, can hold hardship without magnifying it into spectacle. The damp room becomes clear. The hunger takes on solemnity rather than chaos. The endless practice field almost turns musical in its repetition. The castle's night feels companionable. The grim surgery chamber reveals a human being, still striving for understanding with poor tools in hand. So, let this final image linger, small but powerful. A fire burning low but alive. A room so quiet you can hear each breath. A bowl rinsed and set upside down to dry. A cloak hanging close to warmth. A child finally asleep. A corridor lit by one fading light. A monk placing down his quill. A surgeon standing quietly in a kitchen doorway. Outside, darkness endures, vast, patient, and ancient, outlasting every wall built in defiance. Inside, however, people have done their part. They've created just enough warmth to last one more night, just enough light for one more task, just enough hope for one more try, just enough story for one more memory. Beyond this, nothing more need be pushed. The fire ebbs gently. The room quiets alongside it. What lingers is not a conclusion, but a serene silence. And within that quiet, sleep finds its way.